There is something about a castle at night that no other human construction quite matches. You can stand at the edge of a field in central France, or on the banks of a Welsh river, or on a windswept promontory above the Rhine, and look up at the ruins of a medieval castle in the darkness, and feel something ancient and enormous stir in you, a recognition that runs deeper than history lessons or tourist guides, something almost cellular, as though the part of you that is made of deep time remembers what it meant when stone was stacked against stone to this height, for this purpose, by people who understood that they were building not merely a building but a statement written in granite and limestone and sandstone that said, simply and without elaboration, you cannot take this. The night sky above a medieval castle ruin has a particular quality that is different from ordinary darkness. The walls catch the moonlight and hold it. The pale stone of an English keep, the darker limestone of a French chateau fort, the almost black basalt of a Scottish Highland tower, and in that held light you can see something of the original intention of the builders. The walls were meant to be seen. They were meant to be imposing. They were meant to communicate across every possible distance the message that this place was defended, that whoever held it had the means and the will to hold it, and that the cost of attempting to change that fact would be very high indeed. The mist that rises from the moat on a cool autumn evening, or from the river that a castle commands, or from the low ground that surrounds it on three sides, adds something to the atmosphere that the original builders could not have planned, but that seems, in retrospect, entirely appropriate. The mist softens the outlines of the fortification without concealing its mass. It makes the castle seem to float slightly above the earth, which is a visual metaphor that has some truth to it. The castle was, in every meaningful sense, a place that had removed itself from the ordinary world of mud and vulnerability and elevated itself into a different category of existence. The owls that nest in castle ruins are perhaps the most fitting of all the inhabitants these places have accumulated in their long afterlives. Their calls, drifting across the dark courtyard and out through the gaps in the battlements, carry something of the night watch character that the castle always required. Even in peacetime, even in the quietest periods, a castle was never entirely asleep. There were always eyes on the walls, always ears turned to the night. The watch changed. The torches burned low and were replaced. The gate was barred and the portcullis was lowered and the drawbridge was raised, and the castle settled into its nighttime routine, which was vigilance, which was always vigilance, because the castle's entire purpose was to never be caught unprepared. Tonight we're going to inhabit that world, the world of stone and strategy, of moat and murder hole, of the long siege and the desperate sortie, of the ingenuity of builders and the determination of defenders, and the equally fierce determination of attackers. We're going to understand, in the most detailed and the most intimate way, why medieval castles were nearly impossible to conquer. Not impossible. History offers us enough examples of fallen castles to dispel that notion, but nearly impossible, which is itself a remarkable achievement for structures built without powered machinery, without reinforced concrete, without modern engineering. Built by human hands, with human ingenuity, for a human purpose that was as primal and as profound as any purpose humanity has ever set itself. The protection of everything we have from those who would take it. The story of the medieval castle does not begin with the Norman conquest of England in 1066, though that is often where English-speaking people encounter it first. It begins earlier, and it begins in several places at once, as the civilization that would become medieval Europe was learning, sometimes painfully, that the old ways of defence, the hill fort, the earth rampart, the wooden palisade, were not sufficient against the new ways of attack. The Vikings who came out of Scandinavia from the late 8th century onward were not merely raiders. They were military innovators who understood mobility and surprise in ways that settled defensive communities found very difficult to counter. The Magyar horsemen who swept out of the eastern steppes in the 9th century were similarly mobile, similarly devastating, similarly difficult to pin down and defeat in open battle. Against such threats, the fixed fortifications seemed almost absurdly vulnerable, and yet the fixed fortification was what survived. Not the Viking raids, not the Magyar incursions, but the stone tower and the walled enclosure that eventually grew into the full complexity of the high medieval castle. The reason for this is not immediately obvious, because a stone tower cannot pursue a raiding party across the countryside. It cannot go where the threat is. It can only sit in its chosen location and wait for the threat to come to it. But this apparent passivity conceals an active logic that is actually quite sophisticated. If you build your tower in the right place, at a river ford, at a mountain pass, at the centre of a productive agricultural district, you do not need to pursue the raiders, because the raiders must eventually come to you. If they want what is in your territory, they must pass through your defended space. And if your defended space is genuinely difficult to overcome, they will either move on to easier prey, or they will attempt the siege, which will cost them time and blood and resources that they may not be able to afford. This insight, that the castle's power lay not in its mobility, but in its ability to impose costs on anyone who challenged it, was the fundamental strategic logic that drove the extraordinary elaboration of castle design across the medieval period. Every feature of a medieval castle, from the height of its walls to the angle of its towers to the depth of its moat, was a physical expression of the question: how do we make the cost of taking this place so high that no rational attacker will attempt it? And the answer that the medieval builders arrived at through centuries of experience and experiment, and sometimes catastrophic failure, was one of the most sophisticated systems of passive defence that the pre-modern world ever produced. The word castle itself tells us something important. It derives from the Latin castellum, a diminutive of castrum, which means a fortified camp or a military installation. The castellum was specifically a small, independent fortification, not a city wall, not a great Roman legionary fortress, but a discrete structure whose defensive capabilities were self-contained. This distinction matters because it points to one of the key characteristics of the medieval castle that distinguished it from earlier forms of fortification. It was designed to be held by a relatively small garrison. The enormous walls of Roman-era cities required large populations to defend them. The hill forts of the Iron Age required the gathering of an entire tribal community. The medieval castle, by contrast, could be held by a few dozen determined men, which made it a much more flexible and much more economically viable instrument of military power. The earliest true castles, the motte and bailey constructions that the Normans brought to England and spread across their expanding domains in the late 10th and 11th centuries, were relatively simple by the standards of what would come later. The motte was an earthen mound, often artificially constructed, sometimes built up around a natural feature of the landscape. On top of the motte stood the keep, initially a wooden tower that would later be replaced by stone. The bailey was an enclosed courtyard at the base of the motte, surrounded by a wooden palisade and a ditch, where the garrison could stable their horses, store their supplies, and conduct the everyday business of a military household. Simple as it was, the motte and bailey castle embodied the essential defensive logic: elevation for the keep, enclosure for the bailey, and the ditch to slow any attacker before they reached the walls. The transition from wood to stone, which happened in most of Western Europe between the late 11th and the early 13th centuries, and which marks the beginning of what we think of as the classic medieval castle, transformed the nature of the defensive problem. Stone was enormously more resistant to fire than wood, which had been the principal method of attacking wooden fortifications. It was also more resistant to the battering rams and the picks and the mining operations that were the standard toolkit of siege warfare. A well-built stone tower, with walls that might be 10 or 12 or even 15 feet thick at the base, could withstand blows that would have reduced a wooden structure to splinters. It required sustained, organized, expensive effort to overcome, and that was precisely the point. The great building period of medieval castle construction, roughly from 1100 to 1300, saw the elaboration of the basic stone keep into systems of defence of extraordinary sophistication. The concentric castle, with its multiple rings of walls and its carefully planned interlocking fields of fire, was the supreme expression of this defensive ingenuity. The Crusader castles of the Holy Land, built by European knights who had encountered Byzantine and Islamic military architecture and been inspired and instructed by what they found, pushed the concept to its limits. The castles of Wales, built by Edward I of England in the late 13th century as part of his campaign to subdue the Welsh princes, are perhaps the finest examples in the world of late medieval military architecture in its full maturity. A full flowering of everything that 2 centuries of experience had taught the builders about what a castle needed to be. What did a castle need to be? The answer is complex and depends on the specific circumstances of time and place, but certain principles recur across the entire medieval period and the entire medieval world. A castle needed above all to be difficult to approach. This meant situating it on high ground where possible, a rocky crag, a river bend, a ridge above a valley, so that any attacker had to climb to reach it. Where natural elevation was not available, it could be manufactured, as the moat builders had demonstrated. The approach also needed to be controlled, narrow, channeled, overlooked by defensive works that could pour fire and missiles onto anyone who used it. A castle needed to be difficult to enter. This meant multiple barriers at the gate, the most vulnerable point of any fortification, since the gate was by definition a gap in the wall, layered in such a way that breaching one barrier led not to the interior of the castle, but to another barrier, and then another. The gatehouse of a mature medieval castle was in many cases a more elaborate defensive structure than the keep, because the gatehouse was the place where attackers would concentrate their efforts, and where, therefore, the defensive engineering needed to be most inventive. A castle needed to be difficult to climb. This meant walls high enough that scaling ladders would be long and unstable, smooth enough that the climber had nothing to grip, and surmounted by battlements from which defenders could drop or throw or shoot things onto the men trying to climb. It meant towers that projected outward from the curtain wall, giving defenders a view along the face of the wall and the ability to engage attackers who had reached the base of the wall and were therefore out of sight of defenders standing directly above them. A castle needed to be difficult to destroy. This meant walls thick enough to resist the impact of siege engines, and also low enough, relative to their thickness, that they would not topple under that impact. It meant foundations deep enough to resist the miners who would try to undermine the walls by digging tunnels beneath them and burning the wooden props that held the tunnel open, causing the tunnel to collapse and the section of wall above it to fall. It meant in later periods the adoption of the low, thick, angled profiles that were specifically designed to resist artillery. And a castle needed to be able to sustain its garrison for extended periods. This meant a water supply, A well within the castle walls was essential, because control of the water supply was one of the attacker's most powerful weapons. It meant storage space for food and fuel. It meant the capacity to accommodate not just the fighting men, but the horses, the equipment, the servants, the animals, and all the other elements of a medieval military household that needed to be fed and maintained during a siege that might last weeks or months. All of these requirements taken together explain why medieval castles were the most expensive constructions of their era, and why the men who could afford to build them and maintain them were, almost by definition, the most powerful men of their society. A great castle was not merely a defensive installation, it was the physical embodiment of power, of wealth, and of the social order that power and wealth maintained. When you stood before the walls of Caernarfon Castle, or Carcassonne, or the Crac des Chevaliers, you were not merely looking at a military installation. You were looking at a statement of intent, the intent of the people who held this place to continue holding it, against all comers for as long as it took, for as long as they lived, and beyond. There is particular quality to the silence that falls inside a castle ruin late at night, when the tourists have gone and the wind has dropped and the moon is high and full. The stones, which have absorbed centuries of weather and war and the ordinary business of human habitation, seem to give something back in that silence. Not sound exactly, but a kind of resonance, as though the stone itself were vibrating at a frequency just below hearing. What they are vibrating with, perhaps, is the weight of all the intention that went into their placement. Every stone in a castle wall was put there by a human hand, guided by a human mind that was thinking about defense, about geometry, about the specific and practical problem of how to protect what was precious from those who would take it. That intention is still there, in the stone. It does not go away when the castle is abandoned or ruined or converted into a tourist attraction. It remains patient and massive and entirely indifferent to the passage of time. This is the world we are entering tonight, the world of stone and strategy, and the extraordinary human determination to make a place that could not be taken. We will walk the walls and descend into the dungeons and stand at the murder holes and peer through the arrow slits and understand, from the inside, why the people who built these places believed, with considerable justification, that they were building something close to the impregnable. And we'll discover in the course of that walk that they were largely right. To understand why medieval castles were so difficult to conquer, you must first understand them from the inside. Not as a tourist walking through ruins, but as a defender, a person whose life and freedom and everything they valued depended on the defensive qualities of the structure around them. Stand at the base of the keep of Rochester Castle in Kent, which was built in the early 12th century and still stands to its full original height of over 100 feet, and look up. The walls are thick, 12 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly as they rise. The stone is local ragstone and Caen stone, fitted together with a precision that has held for 900 years. There are no windows in the lower stages of the keep because lower stages are vulnerable to attack. The windows, such as they are, begin only at the upper levels. The whole structure has a quality of closed, concentrated power that is unlike anything a purely functional building achieves. The keep, the donjon, or great tower, was the innermost point of the castle's defence, the place of last resort where the garrison would withdraw if the outer walls were taken. It was, in the simplest sense, a tower designed to be too hard to climb, too hard to break, and too hard to undermine. The thickness of the walls was the most fundamental defensive quality of the keep, because thick walls were resistant to both the direct physical assault of battering rams and the indirect assault of mining. The typical Norman keep had walls 3 to 4 metres thick at the base, which meant that a battering ram could pound against the exterior indefinitely without reaching the interior. It also meant that the miners who tried to weaken the foundations by digging underneath them had a very long stretch of stone to work through before they could cause any damage. The entrance to the keep was almost always at first floor level, accessible only by an external staircase that could be removed or destroyed in an emergency. This arrangement meant that there was no door at ground level, the most vulnerable point of any structure, and that the entry point was elevated above the reach of a battering ram and above the immediate approach of any assault party. The external staircase itself was a defensive feature. It was narrow, it was exposed to fire from the tower above, and it could be blocked or destroyed quickly, leaving the keep entirely accessible only by ladder, which was a much more difficult and much more dangerous proposition for an attacking force. The interior of the keep was organised around the requirements of defence as much as the requirements of habitation. The floors were typically arranged with the most defensible spaces at the top. The Lord's Hall and Chamber were usually on the upper floors, not because of any preference for views, but because the upper floors were the last to be taken if an attacking force somehow got inside. The lower floors, which were most accessible to an intruder who had managed to enter the keep, were used for storage, food, water, weapons, equipment, because stored goods could be abandoned in an emergency, while living people could not. The spiral staircase that connected the floors was almost always built to wind clockwise as you ascended, which gave the right-handed defender descending the staircase more room to swing a sword than the right-handed attacker ascending it. This is a small detail, but it is characteristic of the way that the medieval castle builder thought about defence. Every element of the structure was considered from the perspective of the fighting man who would have to use it. As castle design evolved through the 12th and 13th centuries, the keep was gradually supplemented, and in some cases replaced, by a more distributed defensive system based on the curtain wall and the projecting tower. The curtain wall was the outer perimeter of the castle's defences, a continuous stone barrier that enclosed the bailey and provided the first line of defence against any attacker. The height of the curtain wall varied depending on the terrain and the resources of the builder, but a well-built curtain wall was typically 30 to 40 feet high enough that scaling it with ladders was a serious undertaking under any conditions, and essentially impossible under fire from the defenders on the wall walk above. The wall walk, or the parapet walkway along the top of the curtain wall, was protected by the battlements, the alternating merlons, the solid sections of masonry, and crenels, the gaps between them, that give the castle its characteristic silhouette against the sky. This arrangement was not aesthetic but functional. The merlon provided cover for the defender. A man could stand behind it in relative safety while reloading a crossbow or notching an arrow, then step into the crenel to shoot, then step back behind the merlon. The rhythm of this movement, cover, shoot, gave the defenders on the wall a significant tactical advantage over attackers who were exposed in the open below. From behind the battlements, a skilled archer could engage multiple attackers, while remaining largely protected from return fire. The projecting towers that studded the curtain wall at regular intervals were one of the most important innovations of medieval military architecture, and their function was precisely the kind of geometric problem that the castle builders were so good at solving. If you have a straight wall, there is a zone at the base of the wall that is invisible to defenders standing on top of it. The base is directly below them, and to see it they would have to lean out over the parapet in a way that would expose them to danger. This dead zone at the base of the wall was where miners would work, where sappers would plant their explosives, where the men with picks and crowbars would try to dislodge the facing stones. Defenders on the wall above could not easily engage them, but defenders in a tower that projected outward from the wall, a tower that extended beyond the face of the wall by 10 or 15 feet, could look down the face of the wall and engage anyone trying to work at its base. The tower eliminated the dead zone, or at least made it much smaller and much harder to exploit. The machicolations, the stone projections that overhang the tops of walls and towers, with gaps in the floor through which things could be dropped, served the same purpose as the projecting tower, but in a more localized way. Machicolations allowed defenders standing on the wall walk to look straight down the face of the wall and drop stones, hot sand, boiling water, or burning oil onto anyone directly below them. The image of boiling oil being poured onto attackers is one of the most vivid in the popular imagination of medieval siege warfare, and while hot sand and heated water were probably more commonly used, oil was expensive and not always available in the quantities that the movies suggest. The principle is accurate. The machicolations converted the base of the wall from a dead zone into a killing zone, making the approach to the wall as dangerous as the wall itself. The murder hole, the French term was meurtrière, the killing place, was the indoor equivalent of the machicolation. Murder holes were openings in the ceilings of gateways and passageways through which defenders in the rooms above could shoot, drop missiles, or pour unpleasant substances onto attackers who had somehow managed to get into the passage below. The gatehouse of a major medieval castle typically had multiple murder holes positioned along the length of the gate passage, which meant that even if an attacking force managed to breach the outer gate, they were still in a lethal corridor with enemies above them and the inner gate blocking their way forward. The gate passage was, by design, a trap, a place you entered but did not easily leave. The portcullis was the vertical iron or iron-reinforced wooden gate that could be dropped quickly to block the entrance to the castle or to a gate passage. Unlike a conventional door which swings open and therefore requires space to operate and can be damaged at its hinges, the portcullis descended vertically through slots in the walls and was therefore almost impossible to push open from below. It could be operated quickly by a system of counterweights and winches located in the room directly above the gate, which meant that defenders could drop it even under pressure, even if they had very little warning. The portcullis was also very difficult to lift from below. The iron bars at its base were typically pointed, which prevented them from being levered up, and its weight alone made it nearly immovable without the winch mechanism. Many gatehouses had multiple portcullises positioned in sequence along the gate passage, creating a series of barriers that had to be overcome one after another. If the outer portcullis was somehow forced or cut through, the inner portcullis remained. If both portcullises were somehow defeated, there was still the inner gate itself, and beyond that the interior of the castle. Each stage of this penetration took time during which the defenders could pour fire through the murder holes above and the arrow slits in the walls, turning the gate passage into what military planners of a later era would recognize as a kill zone. The drawbridge completed the defensive system of the gate by creating a gap between the gate and the approach path that could not be crossed without the defender's consent. In its simplest form, the drawbridge was simply a wooden platform that could be removed or pulled back to leave an empty space, typically the outer end of a moat or a ditch. In its more elaborate form, it was a counterweighted structure that could be raised quickly by chains, pivoting at the castle end to close against the gate and seal the entrance. The raised drawbridge added another barrier to the sequence that attackers had to overcome. Even before they could reach the portcullis, they had to bridge the gap left by the raised drawbridge, which meant bringing timber or materials under fire and constructing something capable of carrying men. The moat, whether dry or water-filled, served multiple functions beyond simply creating the gap that the drawbridge spanned. A water-filled moat prevented mining, which was one of the most effective techniques available to a besieging force. Mining required digging tunnels toward and beneath the foundations of the wall, and digging tunnels through waterlogged ground was essentially impossible with medieval technology. A well-maintained water moat was therefore a guarantee against the kind of underground attack that could bring a stone wall down in a matter of days. The dry moat, or ditch, was less effective against mining but served the important function of providing a barrier that an attacking force could not easily cross under fire, and of forcing attackers to descend into the ditch, where they were below the level of the wall walk and therefore more exposed, before they could begin climbing the wall. The barbican was an outer defensive work, a fortified outpost that protected the approach to the main gate from outside the main walls. It might be a simple walled enclosure extending from the main gate, or it might be a fully independent tower or pair of towers positioned to control the bridge or the approach road. The barbican served as an advance warning system and an advance killing ground. Attackers who wanted to reach the main gate had to first take the barbican, which was its own defensive problem, and in the process of taking it they would lose time and men while revealing their tactics and numbers to the defenders watching from the main walls. The arrow slit, the narrow vertical opening in the wall through which archers could shoot, was a masterpiece of asymmetric engineering. From the outside, the slit appeared as a narrow crack in the stone, typically no more than 4 or 5 inches wide. From the inside, it splayed outward to give the archer a much wider angle of fire, allowing him to engage targets across a significant arc, without exposing more than a small sliver of his body to return fire. The attacker who tried to shoot an arrow through an arrow slit at the defender on the other side faced a geometrically absurd problem. His target was protected behind several feet of stone, accessible only through a gap narrow enough that hitting it accurately at any distance required exceptional skill, while the defender had a relatively comfortable position from which to shoot at a target who had nowhere to hide. The concentric castle, the castle within a castle, with 2 or more rings of defensive walls at different heights, represented the fullest development of these principles into a complete defensive system. The genius of the concentric design was that every element of the defense supported every other element. If attackers managed to reach and begin to scale the outer wall, they were exposed to fire from the inner wall, which was higher. If they somehow got over the outer wall and into the space between the 2 rings of walls, the outer ward, they were now in a confined space with defenders on both sides of them. On the outer wall they had just climbed, and on the inner wall in front of them. This space, what military historians sometimes call the killing ground between the walls, was arguably the most dangerous place on the entire battlefield, and it was the place that attackers who had overcome the outer wall were forced to occupy. The Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, the great Crusader castle built and maintained by the Knights Hospitaller, is perhaps the finest example of the concentric castle at its most fully developed. It sits on a spur of rock at an elevation that gives it commanding views in every direction, its outer walls following the contours of the spur, and themselves presenting a formidable obstacle. Behind the outer walls lies a space, the lists, and then the inner ward with its even higher walls, its towers, its great hall, its chapel, its cisterns, its storage rooms, its everything. The castle sustained a garrison of perhaps 2,000 men at its peak, and it was besieged repeatedly during the Crusader period without being taken by force. When it finally fell in 1271, it was through negotiation, not assault. The garrison was offered safe conduct by the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, and accepted. The castle itself was never beaten. The castle at Beaumaris in Wales, begun by Edward I in 1295 and never quite completed, is the most perfect concentric castle in Britain, a geometrically precise double ring of walls on a flat site where the natural terrain provided no elevation advantage, and everything had to be achieved through engineering alone. The outer wall, with its dozen flanking towers, encloses the inner ward with its 16 massive towers and 2 gatehouses. Every approach to the inner ward was covered by fire from the outer wall. Every approach to the outer wall was covered by fire from the inner wall. The moats surrounded the entire structure, fed from the sea by a sluice that Edward's engineers constructed specifically to fill it. In its finished form, Beaumaris would have been essentially impregnable against any medieval army. The role of water in castle design went beyond the moat. Many castles were built on or near rivers, not merely for the defensive advantage of having water on one or more sides, but for the practical advantage of a reliable water supply. A well within the castle walls was even more important. The well was the difference between a garrison that could hold out indefinitely and one that would be forced to surrender within days by thirst. Sieges were often decided by water. Attackers who could poison or block the water supply held a decisive advantage, and defenders who had planned well enough to have a deep well and a large cistern could shrug off attempts to cut their supply with relative equanimity. The psychological dimension of castle design, the way that these structures were built to intimidate as much as to defend, deserves attention alongside the purely physical. The height of the keep, the width of the walls, the length of the approach road all serve to impress any visitor, whether friend or foe, with the power and determination of the castle's owner. The great castles of the medieval period were not merely functional, they were statements. The round towers of Chateau Gaillard in Normandy, built by Richard I of England in a single year, 1197 to 1198, at enormous cost and proclaimed by Richard to be invincible, communicated not just defensive capability, but the confidence and ambition of a king who was, in many ways, the finest soldier of his age. The gatehouse of Caernarfon Castle, with its eagle tower and its bands of coloured stone, was a deliberate visual reference to the Theodosian walls of Constantinople, the greatest defensive structure in the medieval world, and the reference was entirely intentional. Edward I wanted his new castles to announce their invincibility before anyone had fired a single arrow at them. A medieval siege was one of the most unpleasant military operations that either side could be involved in, and the fact that it was unpleasant for both the besieging army and the besieged garrison is one of the key reasons why castles were so difficult to conquer. The attacker suffered outside the walls, the defender suffered inside them. Both sides endured hunger and cold and disease and exhaustion, and the particular mental strain that comes from prolonged uncertainty. But the defender had the considerable advantage of being behind the walls, which meant that the attacker's suffering was generally more immediate and more dangerous than the defender's, and that the attacker bore the additional psychological burden of being the one who had to do something, who had to take action, who had to find a way through the stone and iron that the defender was, with relative comfort, simply maintaining. The first challenge of besieging a castle was simply getting your army there. Medieval armies were complex organizations with enormous logistical tails. They required food for thousands of men and horses, equipment and ammunition for siege engines, timber for construction, tools for mining, and everything else that a large force engaged in an extended operation required. Moving all of this cross-country, along medieval roads, which were often rudimentary, across rivers, which required bridges or fords, and through territory that might be hostile was a genuinely difficult operation. The further the castle was from the attacker's home base, the more difficult the supply problem became. Richard I's campaigns in the Holy Land were remarkable not just for their military achievements, but for the logistical achievement of keeping a large army supplied in a hostile environment thousands of miles from home. Once the besieging army arrived before the castle, it had to establish itself in a position that was both secure and effective. Secure from sorties by the garrison, which could be sudden and violent, and from any relief force that the besieged lord might have called upon, and effective in the sense of maintaining a complete blockade of the castle. A complete blockade was essential because a castle that could still receive supplies and reinforcements could hold out indefinitely, and the whole point of the siege was to reduce the garrison to the point where it could no longer resist. To establish a complete blockade of a major castle required a large force, large enough to maintain watch on every approach, every postern gate, every section of the outer wall, and maintaining that large force in the field for months or years required a supply and administrative infrastructure of considerable sophistication. The besieging army typically established itself in a camp, or, for major sieges, a series of camps, at a distance from the castle that was safely beyond the range of missiles thrown or shot from the walls. This distance, typically a few hundred yards, meant that the besiegers were not immediately threatened by the garrison's defensive fire, but it also meant that they were not immediately threatening the castle. The gap between the camp and the walls had to be closed at some point, through the construction of siege engines, through the digging of approach trenches, through the storming of the walls. And closing that gap was where most of the attackers' casualties would be suffered. The diseases that swept through besieging armies were often more lethal than the defenders' weapons. Any large concentration of people in a pre-modern military camp, without adequate sanitation, with limited food supplies and uncertain water, in variable weather, was a breeding ground for dysentery, typhus, typhoid, and a host of other infectious diseases. The siege of Jerusalem by the First Crusade in 1099 was nearly ended by a combination of thirst and disease before the walls were finally stormed. The English siege of Acre during the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1191, killed enormous numbers of crusaders from disease, including Richard I's ally Philip II of France, who withdrew his forces partly because of the sickness in his army. The siege of Calais by Edward III of England in 1346 to 1347 was a relatively successful English operation that nonetheless cost the besieging army heavily in men lost to disease during the 11 months of the siege. The weather was another enemy of the besieging army. A siege that began in autumn might still be ongoing in winter, when the ground froze and the canvas tents of the camp offered inadequate protection against the cold, when the roads became impassable and supply lines became difficult or impossible to maintain, when the morale of men who'd been sitting in a cold field for months watching an apparently impregnable castle began to deteriorate in ways that no commander could entirely prevent. The English siege of Stirling Castle in 1304 was conducted through a Scottish winter, and Edward I's engineers had to construct elaborate wooden structures to house both the siege engines and the men who operated them. Even so, the cold and the rain and the general misery of a winter siege were constant factors that wore down the besieging force as surely as any action by the defenders. The financial cost of a major siege was staggering. Paying and feeding thousands of men for months or years required royal or baronial revenues of a scale that only the wealthiest rulers could manage, and even they frequently ran short. The Siege of Chateau Gaillard by Philip II of France in 1203 to 1204, a major operation that eventually succeeded, required the French king to maintain a large army in the field through an entire winter, at enormous cost. The siege engines had to be built on site, requiring skilled craftsmen, timber, and iron. The supply trains had to be kept moving. The engineers who were managing the mining operations had to be paid and fed. All of this consumed money at a rate that could exhaust even a wealthy treasury, and the attacker who ran out of money before the castle ran out of food was in a very difficult position. The garrison's advantages were significant and real. They had walls between themselves and the attacker, which gave them physical protection that the attacker entirely lacked. They had a fixed, known, carefully planned defensive position that every member of the garrison understood and could operate efficiently. They had stores of food and water that, if the castle had been well provisioned, could sustain them for months. They had the psychological advantage of defending their home, or at least the place where their livelihood and safety depended, which is a powerful motivator, and they had the knowledge that if they held long enough, the attacker's army might dissolve, from disease, from desertion, from the expiry of feudal service obligations, from the arrival of a relief force, or simply from the attacker running out of money and patience. The feudal service obligation is worth pausing on, because it was one of the most significant structural features of medieval warfare and one of the factors that made siege warfare so difficult for attacking forces. In the feudal system, a lord's military power depended on the armed service of his vassals, knights and men-at-arms who owed him a specified period of military service, typically 40 days, in return for the land and protection he provided them. 40 days was adequate for a battle or a raid or a punitive expedition, but it was entirely inadequate for a major siege that might last a year or more. A king who was besieging a castle and found that his army's service obligations were expiring had several options, all of them expensive or difficult. He could pay the men to continue serving as mercenaries. He could release them and try to recruit new forces, or he could abandon the siege. Many sieges were abandoned for exactly this reason, not because the castle proved impregnable, but because the attacker simply could not maintain his army in the field long enough to bring it to a conclusion. The relief force was the other great hope of the besieged garrison. A castle that was besieged was typically the stronghold of a lord who had allies and a suzerain, a lord above him who had an interest in the castle's survival. If those allies could gather a field army and relieve the siege, the besieging force would be caught between the castle and the relief army, a position that was generally catastrophic. The threat of relief was therefore a constant factor in the besieger's calculations, and the decision of how much of his force to keep facing the castle and how much to screen against a potential relief army was one of the most difficult strategic problems in medieval siege warfare. The countervallation and the contravallation were the engineering solutions to the twin problems of the sortie and the relief. A contravallation was a line of fortifications, ditch, bank, palisade, built facing inward toward the castle to contain any sortie by the garrison. A circumvallation was a line of fortifications facing outward to screen the besieging army from a relief force. Building both sets of fortifications simultaneously was a formidable engineering undertaking, requiring enormous quantities of timber and labour. But for a commander who intended a long siege, it was a strategic necessity. Julius Caesar had done it at Alesia, and the medieval commanders who studied classical military history, and many of them did, understood the principle. Philip II's siege operations at Château Gaillard included elaborate circumvallation works that helped him prevent a French relief force from breaking the siege. The psychological war of attrition that accompanied the physical siege was its own dimension of the conflict. Both sides were engaged in a constant effort to maintain their own morale and undermine the others. Defenders would shout insults and challenges from the walls. Besiegers would display the bodies of defenders killed in sorties, or fly banners celebrating their victories. Negotiators would pass back and forth, sometimes genuinely seeking terms, and sometimes simply probing the other side's determination. The garrison's knowledge of conditions outside the walls was always incomplete. They could see the besieging camp, but they could not know whether a relief force was gathering, whether the besieger was running short of money, whether a plague in the enemy camp was thinning their numbers. This uncertainty was its own form of psychological pressure, and the garrison commanders who managed it well, who kept their men confident and purposeful during the long waiting weeks of a siege, were performing a difficult and essential task. Food management inside the castle during a siege was both a practical and a political problem. The garrison commander had to estimate the length of the siege and ration accordingly, but estimating the length of a siege was essentially impossible. It might end tomorrow with a relief force, or it might continue for another year. Rationing too early risked demoralizing the garrison. Rationing too late might leave the garrison genuinely starving before the end. The decision to reduce the food supply of the non-fighting inhabitants of the castle, the servants, the women, the children, sometimes even the horses, was a brutal one but a militarily rational one, and there are historical accounts of garrison commanders expelling the useless mouths from the castle under siege, forcing them out through the gates to be dealt with, or not, by the besieging force. The expulsion of non-combatants during a siege was one of the more terrible features of medieval siege warfare, and the treatment of those expelled varied widely. The besieging commander might allow them to pass through his lines safely, feeding them if he had the resources. He might keep them in the no-man's land between the walls and the besieging lines, in a limbo that was cruel to them, and served the tactical purpose of consuming the garrison's attention and emotional energy. He might refuse to let them pass at all, effectively condemning them to starve in the gap between the two forces. The account of the siege of Calais in 1347, where Edward III ultimately allowed the starving inhabitants of the town to pass through the English lines after a famous intercession by his Queen Philippa, is one of the more humane examples in the historical record, and it was humane enough to be remembered precisely because it was not universal. The siege of Château Gaillard is one of the most instructive episodes in the history of medieval siege warfare, both because of the remarkable defensive qualities of the castle and because of the extraordinary determination of the French king who besieged it. Richard I of England built Château Gaillard in 1197 and 1198, in a single year, which was itself a remarkable logistical achievement, on a rock above the Seine at Les Andelys in Normandy. The castle was Richard's response to the French King Philip II's steady encroachment on English territories in France, and it was built as a statement of intent. Here is the line you will not cross. Richard reportedly said that he would hold it even if its walls were made of butter, and his confidence was not without justification. The castle was extraordinarily well designed, with an outer ward, a middle ward, and an inner ward arranged concentrically, each at a higher level than the last, and the whole situated on a rock spur that made approach difficult from 3 directions. Richard died in 1199, before his confidence could be tested, and it fell to his successor John, a far less capable military commander, to defend Château Gaillard against Philip's siege in 1203 and 1204. Philip arrived with a substantial army and established a blockade that cut the castle off from supply and reinforcement. John made several attempts to relieve the siege, none of them successful, and eventually abandoned the garrison to its fate. The garrison commander, Roger de Lacy, held the castle through an entire winter with a reduced garrison. The non-combatants had been expelled, in an episode that was grim even by medieval standards, but the French engineers were steadily working toward the walls. The fall of Château Gaillard came about through a combination of mining and an ingenious assault through an unexpected entry point. The French miners had managed to undermine and collapse a section of the outer wall, allowing French troops to enter the outer ward. The middle ward fell when French soldiers discovered that they could crawl through the castle's drainage channels, the latrines essentially, and enter the middle ward from inside. This undignified but effective piece of fieldcraft brought a small French force inside the second line of defences and allowed them to open a gate for the rest of the army. The inner ward held for a little longer but eventually fell to the same combination of mining and assault that had taken the outer wards. The fall of Chateau Gaillard in March 1204 was a significant milestone in French history. It opened Normandy to French conquest and marked the effective end of the English Angevin Empire on the continent. But it had taken Philip II 8 months, a large army, considerable engineering skill, and one piece of extraordinary lateral thinking to take a castle that Richard I had built specifically to be impregnable. The siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266 is perhaps the most remarkable example in English history of a garrison holding out against an apparently overwhelming attacking force. Kenilworth was a substantial midland castle with an enormous water defence, an artificial lake created by damming 2 streams, which surrounded the castle on 3 sides and created a water obstacle that made conventional siege approaches extremely difficult. The garrison holding Kenilworth was loyal to Simon de Montfort's cause in the Second Barons' War, and they were holding against a royal army commanded by the future Edward I, which was very well equipped and commanded by one of the finest military minds of the medieval period. The siege lasted from June to December of 1266, 6 months against a besieging force that had the resources of the English crown behind it. The water defence of Kenilworth made conventional mining impossible and made direct assault an extremely unattractive proposition. The Royal Engineers attempted to use floating siege platforms, essentially rafts carrying catapults, positioned on the lake, to bring fire to bear on the walls, but the garrison repulsed these with fire and missiles of their own. The besieging force eventually constructed a fleet of small boats to use for assault operations, but these too were repulsed. It was starvation ultimately that ended the siege. The garrison had consumed its provisions and was in a condition of genuine hardship when it finally negotiated a surrender in December. The terms it received, the dictum of Kenilworth, which allowed the rebels to ransom back their estates, were notably generous, which perhaps reflects the respect that even the royal commander had developed for the garrison's extraordinary tenacity. The siege of Stirling Castle in 1304 is noteworthy for the extraordinary lengths to which Edward I of England went to reduce it, and for the remarkable resilience of the garrison he was besieging. Stirling was the last major Scottish stronghold holding out against Edward's conquest of Scotland, and the garrison consisted of only 30 or 40 men under a constable named William Oliphant. Edward arrived with an army that included the finest siege engineers in the British Isles, and the most elaborate collection of siege engines ever assembled on British soil. 13 machines in total, including a great trebuchet known as the Warwolf that took 3 months to build and required the labour of dozens of skilled craftsmen. The garrison at Stirling fought with extraordinary stubbornness against this overwhelming force for 3 months. They disabled several of the attacking siege engines with their own defensive fire. They conducted sorties against the besieging positions. They repaired damage to the walls with remarkable efficiency. The Warwolf, when it was finally operational, apparently damaged the castle sufficiently that the garrison asked to surrender, and Edward refused their first request, insisting on testing the Warwolf against the damaged walls before accepting the surrender. This theatrical gesture is entirely characteristic of Edward I, who had a keen sense of the symbolic significance of his military actions and the delay almost certainly served the purpose of demonstrating to the watching nobility of both countries the scale of the English military achievement. The garrison eventually surrendered on Edward's terms in July 1304, and the remarkable thing is that those terms were relatively lenient. Edward imprisoned Oliphant and the other defenders, but did not execute them, which was a degree of mercy that the most stubborn garrison commander in Scotland had arguably earned. The fall of Constantinople in 1453, which is not a medieval castle siege in the strictest sense, but which represents the ultimate test of fixed fortification against early gunpowder artillery, provides a sobering perspective on the limits of even the greatest defensive works. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople, built in the 5th century and maintained and improved over the succeeding millennium, were the most formidable defensive walls in the medieval world. They'd resisted sieges by Persians, Arabs, Bulgarians and Russians over the course of 1,000 years. They were triple walls, inner wall, outer wall, and a moat of extraordinary thickness and height, studded with towers at regular intervals, and they protected a city that was supplied by sea from the Bosphorus. What finally overcame them was the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II's possession of an enormous bronze cannon cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, which fired stone balls of unprecedented size. The largest cannon, known as the Basilica, fired balls weighing some 1,200 pounds. No medieval wall had been designed to withstand bombardment of this weight, and the Theodosian walls, for all their magnificence, were not proof against Urban's cannon. The Ottoman artillery battered specific sections of the wall repeatedly over a period of weeks, creating breaches that the defenders, who were massively outnumbered, were physically unable to fully repair. The final assault on May 29th, 1453 went through a breach in the wall near the Blackernay quarter, and the city fell after 53 days of siege. The fall of Constantinople was a watershed moment not only in political and religious history, but in the history of military architecture. It demonstrated clearly that the traditional high curtain wall, however thick and however well maintained, was vulnerable to artillery of sufficient size, and it initiated the crisis in military architecture that would eventually produce the Trace Italian, the system of low, thick, angled earthwork bastions that replaced the medieval curtain wall in the 16th century. But the date of Constantinople's fall, 1453, was near the end of the medieval period as it is conventionally defined, and for most of the preceding centuries the high curtain wall had been entirely adequate against the weapons available to any attacker. The siege of Harlech Castle in Wales during the Wars of the Roses, 1461 to 1468, holds the record for the longest siege in British history, 7 years, during which a Lancastrian garrison held the castle against Yorkist forces. Harlech was one of Edward I's great Welsh castles, situated on a rock above the sea with a water gate that allowed it to be supplied by ship even when surrounded on land. The garrison commander, Dafydd ap Iwan ap Union, and his small garrison held the castle through changes in the political fortune of the war that saw the Lancastrian cause effectively collapse everywhere else in England and Wales. Harlech held because it could be supplied from the sea, and because its walls were genuinely formidable, and because Dafydd ap Union was a man of remarkable determination. When he finally surrendered in 1468, it was under terms that allowed him and his garrison to depart with their lives, a considerable achievement after 7 years of defiance. The Great Siege of Acre in 1291, the last major Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, illustrates what happens when a castle or fortified city falls to an attacker with overwhelming numerical superiority and the will to absorb enormous casualties. The Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil brought an army that contemporary estimates put at between 60,000 and 200,000 men against a city defended by perhaps 15 to 20,000, an entirely lopsided contest. The Mamluk army was equipped with powerful siege engines and used them to good effect, but the fall of Acre was ultimately a product of sheer weight of numbers. The Crusader garrison and the city's inhabitants fought with extraordinary desperation, knowing that no relief was coming and that their only alternatives were death or slavery. But they were overwhelmed by an attack that could absorb any level of casualties without losing its ability to continue. The lesson of Acre was not that castles and fortified cities could not be held, but that no defensive work, however strong, can compensate indefinitely for an insuperable disparity in numbers and resources. The siege of Carcassonne, or rather the various sieges it survived largely intact, offers a counterpoint. The great double-walled city of Carcassonne in southern France was besieged repeatedly during the Albigensian Crusade of the 13th century, and it never fell to direct assault. Simon de Montfort the Elder, the father of the Simon de Montfort who would later trouble Henry III of England, besieged it in 1209 and obtained its surrender through negotiation rather than storm. The defenders were allowed to leave with their lives, which they accepted because they recognized that direct assault on the walls was not going to succeed. The city itself continued to be a formidable defensive position, and the massive restoration work carried out by the architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc in the 19th century, however controversial among architectural historians, at least has the virtue of making it clear to modern visitors just how imposing these walls originally were. Standing at the base of Carcassonne's outer walls today, looking up at the towers with their witch hat roofs and the battlements that march along the wall walk above, you understand viscerally why any attacking commander would prefer to negotiate rather than assault. The Siege of Harfleur by Henry V in 1415, a prelude to the more famous Battle of Agincourt, illustrates the human cost of siege operations on both sides. Henry arrived before Harfleur with an army of perhaps 10,000 men in August 1415 and invested the town, which was defended by a competent garrison under a capable commander. The siege lasted 5 weeks, during which disease, dysentery principally, swept through the English camp and killed or incapacitated thousands of men. By the time Harfleur surrendered in late September, Henry's effective force had been reduced by perhaps a third, which is one of the reasons that his subsequent march to Calais and his battle at Agincourt were such an extraordinary gamble. He won, as it turned out, but the siege that preceded it had cost him dearly, not in battle casualties, but in the slow, invisible attrition of disease that siege warfare invariably inflicted on both sides. The experience of living inside a castle under siege was one of the most extreme forms of human psychological endurance that the medieval world produced. It combined the physical challenges of confined space, rationed food, and constant physical danger with the psychological challenges of uncertainty, boredom, fear, and the knowledge that the world outside the walls had ceased to be accessible. The garrison and the non-combatants who sheltered within the castle walls were in a situation that was, in many ways, more like that of a ship's crew in a storm than like anything on land. They were entirely dependent on the structure around them, entirely unable to leave, and entirely focused on the single objective of survival, until conditions changed. The daily routine of a castle under siege was shaped first of all by the watch. The walls had to be continuously manned, every section of the wall walk, every tower, every gate, because an attack could come at any time and without adequate warning. This requirement for continuous manning divided the garrison into watches, typically rotating every few hours, which meant that every man in the garrison was spending a significant portion of his day or night on the cold, exposed wall-walk, looking out at the besieging camp and waiting. Waiting was, in many ways, the defining experience of the siege for the defending garrison. Waiting for an attack, waiting for a relief force, waiting for the besieging army to give up, waiting for supplies to run out. The mental discipline required to maintain effective vigilance during long periods of enforced waiting was significant, and garrison commanders who could sustain their men's alertness and morale during the waiting weeks and months were performing a genuinely difficult command function. Food was the central preoccupation of life under siege, and the management of the castle's provisions was one of the garrison commander's most important responsibilities. A well-provisioned castle at the beginning of a siege might have enough food to last a year or more. Dried grain, salted meat, dried fish, preserved vegetables, oil, wine or ale, and whatever else the steward had managed to accumulate before the siege began. But the consumption of a garrison and its dependents was continuous, and the reserves that seemed ample at the beginning of the siege might look much less ample after 6 months, and desperate after a year. The rationing system had to balance the need to maintain the fighting men's strength. An underfed man cannot fight effectively, against the need to extend the food supply as long as possible. The variety of food available under siege conditions was extremely limited, and the monotony of the diet was itself a form of attrition. When the fresh food was gone, the vegetables from the kitchen garden within the walls, the eggs from the chickens kept in the bailey, the milk from the few cattle that might have been brought inside, the garrison was dependent on the preserved stores, which were nutritious but deeply unvaried. Salt meat and hard bread and dried peas, day after day after day, in quantities that decreased as the siege went on, was the dietary reality of a long siege, and the cumulative effect of this monotonous, inadequate diet on the physical and psychological health of the garrison was significant. Scurvy, the deficiency disease caused by lack of vitamin C, was a real risk in any prolonged siege, and its symptoms, bleeding gums, loosening teeth, weakness, depression, would have been familiar to any medieval garrison that had been confined for several months. Water was often more critical than food. A castle with a good well and a large cistern had a significant advantage over one that depended on rainwater collection or supplies brought in from outside the walls. The well was so important that it was typically located in the most protected part of the castle, the inner ward or even beneath the keep, and its defence was a priority even in the most chaotic of assaults. Attackers who managed to contaminate or destroy the water supply of a besieged castle had, in most cases, effectively ended the siege, because a garrison without water could not hold out for more than a few days, regardless of how much food it had or how formidable its walls were. The social dynamics within the castle walls during a siege were complex and not always harmonious. The garrison consisted of knights and men-at-arms whose status and obligations were clearly defined, but the castle also contained servants, artisans, priests, women, and children, all of whom were present in varying numbers and all of whom had needs and concerns that the garrison commander had to manage alongside the purely military problem of the defence. The servants and artisans were essential to the functioning of the castle. The blacksmith who maintained weapons and armour, the carpenter who repaired damage to the gates and drawbridge mechanisms, the cook who managed the increasingly strained food supply, but they were also mouths to feed and potential sources of demoralizing complaint. The women in a castle under siege were in a situation that combined considerable danger with severe constraint. The lord's wife might take a significant role in the defence. There are several historical examples of noblewomen who commanded castle defences in their husband's absence, the most famous being the Countess of Montfort, who held Hennebont in Brittany in 1342 against a French force while her husband was imprisoned. But more typically, the women of the castle were non-combatants who contributed to the defence through the management of domestic functions, the distribution of food, the care of the wounded, the maintenance of the chapel's religious services that sustained the garrison's morale, while living with the constant fear that a breach in the walls would expose them to the mercy of an attacking force, which was not always forthcoming. Religion was a more constant presence in the life of a castle under siege than it is possible for most modern people to fully appreciate. The chapel was one of the essential rooms in any castle, and its priest was a significant figure in the castle's social hierarchy. Daily religious observance, the Mass, the canonical hours, continued even under siege conditions because it was both spiritually important and psychologically useful. The act of gathering together for prayer, of reaffirming the community's connection to something beyond the immediate crisis, was one of the most effective tools available to a garrison commander for maintaining morale. The priest who could keep his flock spiritually steady during a long and difficult siege was doing as much for the defence as the man who was maintaining the weapons on the wall. The wounded presented a particular challenge. Medieval surgery was crude by modern standards, and the wounds inflicted by arrows, crossbow bolts, sword cuts, and the falling masonry of a mine collapse were often fatal, even when not immediately so. The castle's supply of medical materials, bandages, cauterizing irons, the various herbal medicines that were the standard treatments of the era, would not have been unlimited, and managing the wounded in conditions of cramped space and limited cleanliness was difficult. Infection was the great killer of the medieval wounded, and in the confined environment of a besieged castle, where hygiene was already strained, the risk of infection was particularly high. The garrison that had a skilled medical practitioner, a barber surgeon or a physician, though the latter was uncommon outside royal establishments, was significantly better positioned than one that relied entirely on the garrison's own improvised medical care. The sounds of a castle under siege had a distinctive quality that varied with the phase and the intensity of the operation. During the long quiet periods, the weeks when the besieging army was simply maintaining its blockade without active assault operations, the sound landscape inside the walls was almost normal. The creak of the gate mechanisms, the clatter of weapons maintenance, the voices of men in conversation, the prayers from the chapel, the occasional cry of a child. But when the assault was active, when the trebuchets were throwing their projectiles and the scaling parties were approaching the walls, and the archers on the wall-walk were shooting as fast as they could, the sound was an overwhelming, chaotic tumult that lasted for hours, and left survivors shaking and temporarily deafened, the stone walls ringing with the impact of stones and the screaming of the wounded. The nighttime under siege had its own particular quality. The fires of the besieging camp were visible from the walls, red and distant through the darkness, a constant reminder of the enemy's presence. The sentries on the wall-walk moved in their slow, cold patrol, listening for any sound that might indicate a night assault, the muffled sound of a mining party at work, the creak of a siege engine being repositioned, the soft splash that might indicate men crossing the moat. Night attacks were relatively rare in medieval siege warfare, partly because the darkness that made them potentially safer for the attacker also made coordination extremely difficult. But they were not unknown, and the garrison that relaxed its vigilance at night on the assumption that the enemy would not attack in darkness was taking an unjustifiable risk. The sortie, The aggressive action in which a portion of the garrison left the castle to attack the besieging forces was one of the garrison's most important tactical tools. A well-executed sortie could destroy siege engines, disrupt mining operations, capture prisoners whose information was valuable, and most importantly demonstrate to both the garrison and the besieging army that the defenders were not simply waiting passively for relief, but were actively contesting the siege. The psychological effect of a successful sortie on garrison morale was considerable. Men who had spent weeks watching the enemy work unmolested needed to feel that they were not entirely helpless, and the sortie provided that feeling. The planning and execution of sorties was one of the most demanding aspects of the garrison commander's role, because a sortie that went wrong, that lost men who could not be replaced, or that allowed the enemy to follow the returning defenders through the gate, could be catastrophic. The question of when to negotiate and when to fight on was the most fundamental strategic decision facing the garrison commander, and it was made under conditions of imperfect information and extreme stress. Holding too long, fighting on past the point where negotiated surrender could have obtained reasonable terms, was a real risk, because an attacker who had been made to work hard and wait long for the castle's surrender was often in a punitive mood when it finally fell. The history of medieval siege warfare includes many instances of garrisons that were massacred or imprisoned after unnecessarily prolonged resistance. But surrendering too quickly, giving up before the castle's defensive resources were genuinely exhausted, was dishonor, and in a society where military honor was a fundamental social value, the garrison commander who surrendered prematurely faced consequences almost as severe as the one who surrendered too late. The code of chivalric conduct that governed the treatment of prisoners and the terms of surrender was, in theory, a significant moderating influence on the violence of siege warfare. A garrison that surrendered in reasonable time and on terms agreed by both parties was entitled to certain protections. The fighting men would typically be ransomed or released on parole. The women and children would be treated with a degree of consideration. The property might be allowed to be removed. These protections were not universal and were not always honoured, but their existence meant that the decision to surrender was not necessarily the catastrophe that it might appear. Many garrison commanders who negotiated surrenders after a reasonable period of resistance were able to obtain satisfactory terms and live to fight another day, sometimes quite literally. The attacking commanders who faced a well-built medieval castle had a number of options available to them, all of them difficult and most of them expensive. Understanding these options, the physical reality of what they required and what they could accomplish, is essential to understanding why castles were so hard to take. The direct assault, the frontal attack on the walls with scaling ladders, was the simplest and most immediately dangerous option. It required the attackers to cross the open ground between their positions and the base of the wall, negotiate the moat, apply the scaling ladders, and climb the walls under fire from the defenders above. Every step of this process was conducted under the arrows and crossbow bolts and thrown missiles of the men above, and the men below had almost no cover. The mortality rate in frontal assaults on well-defended walls was very high, and most experienced commanders avoided this option unless they had specific reasons to believe the walls were undermanned or the garrison was demoralized. The commanders who ordered frontal assaults were either desperate, very confident, or both, and the results were often appalling. The trebuchet was the most powerful siege engine of the medieval period, and its operation was the dominant feature of any major siege from the 12th century onward. The trebuchet worked by the principle of the counterweight, a heavy box or bucket filled with earth or stone, attached to the short end of a long throwing arm, which when released caused the long end of the arm to swing up and forward, throwing the projectile at the end of a sling with enormous force. A large trebuchet could throw a stone of 300 pounds over a range of several hundred yards, and the impact of such a stone on a wall, even a thick stone wall, was considerable. Repeated impacts in the same location, day after day, could crack and eventually breach a wall, and the trebuchet was therefore the primary tool of the attacker, who intended to make a practical breach rather than simply wear down the defender. The construction of a trebuchet on site was a major engineering undertaking. The machine required large quantities of seasoned timber, which had to be transported to the site, skilled carpenters to assemble it, blacksmiths to manufacture the iron fittings, and a trained crew to operate it. The counterweight alone weighed several tons and had to be assembled from heavy materials, earth, stone, lead, that were not always easily available. Building a trebuchet took weeks, and the machine itself was vulnerable to fire from the castle and to the occasional well-directed sortie. Castles sometimes had their own trebuchets positioned on the walls or in the courtyards, creating the fascinating situation of both sides hurling stones at each other across the space between the castle and the besieging camp. The accuracy of the trebuchet was limited. It was a weapon of area bombardment rather than precision targeting, but what it lacked in accuracy it compensated for in power and persistence. The mangonel and the ballista were the trebuchet's predecessors and in some cases contemporaries. The mangonel was a torsion-powered catapult. It used the energy stored in twisted ropes or sinew to throw its projectile, and while it was less powerful than the large trebuchet, it was more portable and faster to set up. The ballista was essentially a large mechanical bow, firing bolts or heavy darts with considerable velocity and reasonable accuracy. The ballista was particularly effective as a defensive weapon, mounted on the walls of a castle to engage enemy siege equipment and personnel at range. The tactical interaction between the castle's ballista crews and the attackers' trebuchet teams was one of the ongoing technical contests of a siege, each side trying to put the other's engines out of action. Mining was often the most effective of all the techniques available to a besieging force, and its effectiveness was precisely what drove the development of the water moat as the standard defensive feature of castle design. The process of mining a castle wall began with the digging of a tunnel from a point outside the besieging force's lines, concealed from the defender's view if possible, toward and beneath the foundation of the target section of wall. The tunnel was propped as it advanced with wooden posts and beams, and when it had extended far enough beneath the wall, the miners would pack the tunnel with combustible material, wood, hay, sometimes animal fat, and set it alight. The burning wood caused the props to fail, the tunnel to collapse, and the ground above it to subside, taking the section of wall into the void created by the collapse. If the mining was skillfully executed, the wall would collapse cleanly and create a breach that the waiting assault party could immediately exploit. The defenders were not helpless against mining. They could detect the progress of a mine by placing bowls of water on the ground inside the castle. The vibration of the miners' picks would cause ripples in the water, indicating the direction and approximate location of the tunnel. Once detected, the defenders could dig a counter-mine, a tunnel from inside the castle toward the attacker's mine, with the intention of breaking into it and either flooding it, fighting the miners in the tunnel, or burning their timbers before they could be fired. Countermining was extremely dangerous work. The tunnel was dark, confined, liable to collapse, and the men who encountered the enemy miners in its depths were fighting in conditions of near total darkness, with no room to maneuver. But it was effective, and garrison commanders who had skilled miners available used this technique frequently. The siege tower, or belfry as it was often called, was the attempt to bring the attackers' weapons and men to the level of the defenders on the wall walk. A siege tower was a large wooden structure, typically 5 to 6 stories tall, mounted on wheels and rolled toward the wall. The tower was sheathed in wet hides to resist fire, and its upper stories contained archers and crossbowmen who could engage the defenders on the wall at approximately the same level. When the tower reached the wall, a drawbridge at its upper level was dropped across the gap, and the assault party rushed across onto the wall walk. In theory, the siege tower converted the most dangerous part of the assault, the exposed approach to the wall, into a relatively protected operation. In practice, it was extremely difficult to move a large wooden tower over the uneven ground of a siege approach under fire, and many siege towers were destroyed by fire, toppled by the defenders, or simply stuck in the ground before they reached the wall. Battering rams were the oldest siege weapon, and against the gates of a well-built medieval castle the least effective. The simple ram, a heavy wooden or iron-tipped log swung against the gate by a team of men, had been the standard assault tool of ancient siege warfare. Against the wooden gates of an early medieval fortress, it was still useful. Against the iron-reinforced double doors, multiple portcullises, and raised drawbridge of a mature medieval gatehouse, it was much less effective. The ram also required the men operating it to approach the gate directly, which meant crossing the open area in front of the gate under fire from the defenders above, a suicidal prospect unless the defenders had been suppressed by archery. The covered ram, a large shed-like structure on wheels, under which the ram team could work in relative protection, was a more sophisticated version that addressed this problem, but it was still difficult to use effectively against a well-prepared gate. The use of incendiary weapons was a constant feature of both offensive and defensive operations in castle siege warfare. Fire was the enemy of wooden structures everywhere: gates, drawbridges, siege towers, temporary wooden fighting platforms, the interior buildings of the castle bailey. And both sides used fire as a weapon whenever they could. Fire arrows, arrows with small pots of oil-soaked burning material attached, shot in high arcs to land on combustible surfaces, were a standard piece of equipment for any archer engaged in siege operations. Greek fire, a compound of uncertain composition that burned even on water, apparently based on naphtha, pitch, and various chemical additives, was the ultimate incendiary weapon of the Byzantine and Islamic military traditions, and was much feared in Crusader warfare. The defenders of a castle under bombardment spent as much time fighting fires as fighting people, and the ability to quickly extinguish fires in a confined space where water was rationed was an important aspect of siege defense that is not always given adequate attention. Psychological warfare was practiced by both sides in a medieval siege with considerable sophistication. The attacker might display the corpses of men captured in sorties on poles visible from the walls, intended to break the garrison's morale. He might execute prisoners in view of the garrison, particularly if they were family members of the garrison's commander. He might make offers of safe conduct to create divisions within the garrison between those who wanted to accept and those who wanted to hold on. The defender might respond by displaying the heads of attackers killed in sorties, or by shouting taunts from the battlements, or by demonstrating conspicuous feasting within the walls, wasting food, essentially, as a signal of abundance that was sometimes real and sometimes theatre. The use of disease as a weapon, what we would now call biological warfare, was not unknown in medieval siege operations, though it was rare. The most famous example is the Mongol siege of Kaffa on the Black Sea in 1346, where the Mongol attackers catapulted the bodies of plague victims over the walls of the Genoese trading city, apparently hoping to infect the defenders. Whether this actually caused the epidemic within Kaffa, or whether the epidemic was spreading through the region independently of the deliberate action, is uncertain, but the fact that the method was used is itself significant. Medieval commanders understood, even without germ theory, that diseased bodies could spread disease, and a few were willing to use that knowledge as a weapon. The Genoese merchants who fled Caffa and returned to Italy may have brought the Black Death to Europe with them, which would make this act of biological warfare one of the most consequential in history, however unintentionally. Starvation, the slow, inexorable reduction of the garrison, and its dependence to a condition where they were physically unable to continue resistance, was the most reliable siege technique available to any attacker with the patience and resources to apply it. A castle that was completely blockaded, that received no supplies from outside and no relief force, would inevitably exhaust its provisions and its water if the siege continued long enough. The question was whether the attacker could maintain the siege until that point, and the history of medieval siege warfare is full of cases where he could not, where the attacker's army dissolved from disease or desertion, or the expiry of service obligations, where a relief force finally fought its way through, where the expense of the siege exceeded the attacker's financial resources. The castle's ultimate defense against starvation was the inefficiency and fragility of medieval siege operations, which meant that the castle needed only to outlast the attacker's ability to maintain the siege, not his willingness to conduct it indefinitely. The evolution of castle design, from motta to concentric wonder. The story of castle design is, at its core, the story of an arms race. Every improvement in the attacker's technology or tactics prompted a corresponding improvement in the defender's architecture, and that improvement prompted a new offensive innovation, and so on through the 3 centuries of intensive castle building that produced the magnificent defensive complexes of the high medieval period. Understanding this evolutionary dynamic, the way that each generation of castles was a response to the weaknesses revealed in the generation before, is one of the most illuminating ways to approach medieval military history. The Motte and Bailey castle of the Norman period was, as we've noted, a relatively simple structure. Its primary virtue was speed of construction. A motte could be thrown up and a wooden tower erected on it in a matter of weeks, which made it an ideal instrument for rapidly establishing military control over a newly conquered territory. William the Conqueror and his followers built dozens of Motte and Bailey castles in England in the years immediately following 1066, and this rapid castle-building program was a major factor in the speed and thoroughness of the Norman conquest of England. The castles did not need to be impregnable. They needed to exist, to be present in the landscape as visible symbols of Norman authority and as refuge points for Norman garrisons when the local population rose against them. The weakness of the Motte and Bailey castle was fire. Wooden structures burn. As the Norman hold on England and other territories became more secure, the most important castles were rebuilt in stone. The square keep, or donjon, replaced the wooden tower on the motte, and the wooden palisade of the bailey was replaced by a stone curtain wall. This process of rebuilding in stone was not simultaneous or uniform. It proceeded castle by castle as resources allowed, but by the middle of the 12th century the major English and Norman castles were predominantly stone constructions, and the age of the Great Keep was at its height. The square keep had a significant vulnerability that became apparent as siege techniques improved: its corners. The corners of a square tower were relatively easy to undermine, because the mining had only to bring down a relatively small section of the corner to cause a portion of the tower to collapse. The round tower, which had no corners, which presented a continuously curved surface to any mining attempt, and which also had better fields of view from its interior, was the answer to this vulnerability, and from the late 12th century onward, Round towers became increasingly common in castle design, both as isolated keeps and as flanking towers in curtain walls. The experience of the Crusades had an enormous influence on the development of European castle design in the late 12th and 13th centuries. The Crusader knights who went to the Holy Land encountered military architecture of a sophistication that exceeded anything in contemporary Western Europe. The Byzantine Empire had maintained the traditions of Roman military engineering, and the castles of Anatolia and Syria were in many cases far more elaborate and more efficiently designed than anything the Crusaders had left behind at home. The influence of this encounter on returning Crusaders, who went home to their estates in England, France and Germany, and rebuilt their castles using what they had learned in the East, was significant and direct. The concentric castle emerged from the combination of Byzantine and Islamic influence with the specifically Western innovation of the projecting tower. The idea of placing a second, higher ring of walls inside the first ring was not new. Byzantine military architecture had used it, but the Western adaptation added the systematic use of projecting towers to both rings, giving the defenders of each ring the ability to engage attackers at the base of that ring's walls. In a mature concentric design, every point on every wall was covered by fire from at least one flanking tower. The inner walls were high enough to give their defenders clear fields of fire, the outer walls, and the space between the two rings was a killing ground from which there was effectively no escape once the outer wall was scaled. The Edwardian castles of Wales, built by Edward I in the 1280s and 1290s as part of his military subjugation of the Welsh princes, represent the highest achievement of this concentric design tradition in the British Isles. Harlech, Beaumaris, Conwy, Caernarfon, Rhuddlan, Flint. Each of these castles was designed by Master James of St. George, the greatest military architect of the medieval period, who had served under the Count of Savoy before Edward hired him, at a salary that reflected the value placed on his extraordinary skill. Master James brought to Wales the latest thinking in military architecture, much of it derived from the castle-building tradition of Savoy and the more easterly traditions he had absorbed, and the result was a series of castles that were not merely defensive installations, but architectural masterpieces of functional design. The castles of the Crusader states, fortresses at the end of the world. The Crusader states established in the Levant after the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, created the most demanding military environment that Western European knighthood had ever faced. The Crusader lords held small territories surrounded by much larger and often more powerful Muslim states, and their hold on those territories depended entirely on the quality of their fortifications. This reality produced, over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, some of the finest castle building in the world, as the Crusader lords and the military orders that held many of the key fortifications poured enormous resources into creating defensive works that could compensate for their numerical weakness. The military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller in particular, became the most important castle builders and castle holders in the Crusader states. The orders had the financial resources of their European land holdings and donations to fund major construction projects. They had a permanent, professional garrison that did not suffer from the feudal service limitations that plagued secular lords, and they had the institutional commitment to the long-term defence of specific sites that individual lords, who might die or leave or transfer their allegiances, could not consistently provide. The great Hospitaller castles of the Crac des Chevaliers and Marcab and the Templar castle of Tortosa were the products of this sustained institutional investment, and they were, by any measure, extraordinary achievements. The Crac des Chevaliers deserves extended attention. Situated on a rocky spur in the mountains of what is now western Syria, it commanded a pass through which any army marching between Antioch and Damascus would have to travel. The Hospitallers acquired it in 1142 and rebuilt and expanded it continuously over the following century, creating what is generally considered to be one of the finest medieval castles in the world. The outer walls followed the natural contours of the rock, presenting a continuous defensive surface that used the terrain to its maximum advantage. The inner ward, higher than the outer, had walls of extraordinary thickness and towers that projected well beyond the wall face. The great tower at the southwest corner, the Warden's Tower, had walls that were 10 meters thick at the base. Not even the largest trebuchet could have battered through them in any reasonable time. The Crac was besieged repeatedly, 12 times by some accounts, during the Crusader period, and it was never taken by direct assault. Its final surrender in 1271 was achieved by Baybars through a combination of sustained pressure, the cutting off of supplies and reinforcements, and, according to some accounts, a forged letter purporting to be from the Hospitaller Grand Master ordering the garrison to surrender. Whether the letter was genuine or forged is disputed, but the outcome was the same. The garrison of some 200 men surrendered the castle after a brief siege, under terms that allowed them to leave safely. The scale of the engineering that had protected 2 centuries of Hospitaller occupation of this strategic position is visible today. The castle is remarkably well preserved, and gives visitors perhaps the most immediate sense of what a high medieval castle actually felt like of any site in the world. German castles, the Rhineland and beyond. The castles of the Rhineland in Germany occupy a special place in the European imagination of the medieval castle, partly because they are so numerous and so well preserved, and partly because their dramatic setting, perched on rocky crags above the winding Rhine, their towers reflected in the cold grey river below, corresponds so exactly to the romantic image of the medieval castle that generations of painters and poets and novelists have elaborated. The Rhineland was one of the most intensively castellated regions of medieval Europe, with more than 100 castles in the relatively short stretch of the Rhine between Bingen and Koblenz, most of them built between the 12th and the 14th centuries. The density of castles along the Rhine reflected the political fragmentation of medieval Germany, where the power of the Holy Roman Emperor was constantly contested by the princes and bishops and counts who controlled individual territories, and where the control of the Rhine, one of the most commercially important rivers in Europe, was an object of perpetual competition. Each castle was the seat of a lord who could levy tolls on river traffic passing below, and the income from this toll collection was both the reason for building the castle and the means of maintaining it. The traveller on the Rhine in the 13th century passed through a succession of these jurisdictions, paying tolls at each one, in a system that was remarkably similar in its economic logic to modern highway tolls, though rather more aggressively enforced. The Burgeltz, which survives remarkably intact in the Mosel Valley, illustrates the particular character of the German Rhineland castle. It is not a military installation in the strict sense. It was never seriously besieged, but it was built and expanded to be a formidable defensive proposition, and its position in a river loop that made it approachable from only one direction meant that it needed to defend only a single approach. The castle was held jointly by 3 branches of the Eltz family for nearly 6 centuries, an arrangement that produced the distinctive cluster of towers that gives the castle its fairy tale appearance. Each branch of the family built its own residential tower within the shared defensive enclosure, so that the castle is actually 3 separate tall towers crammed together inside a single outer wall. The result is strange and beautiful and entirely logical once you understand the family dynamics that produced it. The Teutonic Knights, who conquered and colonized the Baltic lands of Prussia and Latvia in the 13th and 14th centuries, built a series of castles in the north that have a distinctive character all their own. The Ordensburg, the Order's castle, was designed for the specific conditions of the Baltic frontier, where the enemy was not a professional army conducting formal sieges, but a mobile, elusive population conducting guerrilla warfare. The Ordensburg was therefore less focused on the concentric defensive systems of the Western tradition, and more focused on providing a secure base for mounted operations. Marienburg, now Malbork in Poland, the Teutonic Order's headquarters from 1309, is the largest brick castle in the world, covering some 21 hectares and consisting of 3 separate wards, each walled, and together constituting the political and administrative centre of the Order's Baltic Empire. Scottish castles, stone and mist. The castles of Scotland have a character that is distinct from those of England and France, shaped by the particular geology and climate and political history of the country. The abundance of hard stone, granite in the north and east, sandstone in many other regions, meant that stone building was practical even for relatively modest lords. The climate, cold, wet, with mist a near-permanent feature of the Highland landscape, gave the castles a brooding quality that is inseparable from the Scottish aesthetic of the medieval period. And the political situation, a kingdom that was repeatedly subject to English attempts at domination, that fought wars for its independence with a tenacity that astonished its opponents, and that therefore needed its castles to be genuinely defensible rather than merely impressive, produced fortifications that were built for use rather than for show. Edinburgh Castle, which sits on its volcanic rock above the Scottish capital, is in some ways the definitive expression of the Scottish castle in its most essential form: impregnable site, minimal construction, maximum use of natural defensive advantage. The volcanic crag on which Edinburgh Castle stands is sheer on 3 sides, approachable only from the east along a ridge that channels any attacker into a narrow front. The castle has been besieged multiple times in its history and has changed hands repeatedly, but it has never been taken by direct assault. Every change of hands has come about through treachery, surprise, starvation, or negotiation. The rock itself is the castle's primary defence, and the builders recognised this and concentrated their construction resources on the vulnerable eastern approach, trusting the rock on the other 3 sides to do the defensive work that walls could not do more effectively. The tower house was the distinctive Scottish contribution to medieval castle design, a form that suited the particular conditions of the country with remarkable efficiency. The tower house was essentially a tall rectangular stone tower that served as both the primary residence and the primary defensive structure of its occupant. Unlike the English castle, which separated the keep from the curtain wall and the curtain wall from the gate, the tower house concentrated all defensive and residential functions in a single structure that could be built relatively quickly and maintained relatively cheaply. The entrance was at ground level, protected by a heavy iron door, the yett, that was also a specific Scottish innovation, a door made of interlaced iron bars that could not easily be sawed through, and that admitted light and air while remaining impenetrable. Above the door the floors were connected by a spiral stair, and the upper floors provided increasingly comfortable accommodation as they rose above the reach of any attacker. The psychology of the castle, fear, awe, and the message in the stone. The psychological function of the castle, its role as a statement of power, a source of fear and awe in those who looked at it, a demonstration of the owner's authority and resources, was at least as important as its physical defensive function, and in many periods of the medieval world it was more important. A castle that was never besieged, that sat in its landscape for generations without experiencing a major military test, was still performing its essential function as long as it was maintaining the fear that prevented challengers from making the attempt. The sight of a great castle from a distance was calibrated to produce a specific emotional effect. The height of the walls, the scale of the towers, the mass of the stone, all of these were designed to communicate at the level of pure instinct that this was a place of overwhelming power. The peasant travelling along the road below the castle walls felt it as a physical presence. The shadow of the walls, the sound of wind around the battlements, the distant figures of sentries visible on the wall walk, and that physical presence communicated the social and political reality of the medieval world, that the lord who held this castle held the surrounding countryside, and that the lord's power was as solid and as permanent as the stone above which expressed it. The interior of the castle communicated a different but complementary message. The great hall, the centre of the castle's social and political life, was designed to impress visitors with the lord's wealth and dignity. The high ceiling, the long hearth down the centre, the lord's table on its raised dais, the heraldic decorations on the walls, the ordered ceremony of meals and audiences, all of these were aspects of a performance of power that the physical setting of the castle enabled and intensified. A king or a great lord who received visitors in the hall of a major castle was wrapping himself in the accumulated authority of the stone around him, and the visitors who came to pay homage or petition for favour felt that authority as something almost physical. The dungeon, the prison, the place of confinement below the castle, was the dark face of the castle's authority, the demonstration that the lord's power extended not merely over land and labour, but over the bodies and the freedom of those who challenged it. The word dungeon derives from the same French root as donjon, the keep, and the association between the keep and the prison was built into the medieval castle's vocabulary from the beginning. To be imprisoned in a lord's castle was to be entirely in his power, in a situation from which escape was essentially impossible, dependent entirely on his mercy for the most basic conditions of existence. The psychological weight of this, the knowledge that the walls that protected the garrison and impressed the visitor could also contain and destroy the enemy, was part of the castle's comprehensive statement of power. The experience of approaching a castle for the first time, travelling the long approach road, passing through the outer defences, entering the gate passage with its portcullises and murder holes, emerging into the courtyard, was a carefully managed sequence of psychological impressions. Each stage of the approach revealed something new of the castle's scale and complexity, while the narrowing and channeling of the path communicated, at a level below conscious thought, the visitor's increasing dependence on the Lord's goodwill. By the time the visitor stood in the inner courtyard, with walls rising on every side and guards visible at every gate, the message had been delivered completely. You are here because we have allowed you to be here, and you will leave when we decide to let you go. Water defences, moats, rivers, and the sea. The relationship between medieval castles and water was intimate and multifaceted. Water served the castle as a defensive barrier, as a supply, as a transport route, and as a symbol. The moat that surrounded a castle was, among other things, a visual signal of the castle's separateness from the ordinary world, the physical expression of the Lord's detachment from the common run of humanity. The bridge over the moat was the literal and metaphorical threshold between the ordinary world and the privileged space of the castle, and the act of crossing it was not trivial. The water moat was at its most effective when it was deep enough to prevent wading and wide enough to make bridging under fire a significant engineering challenge. The ideal moat was also supplied with running water, rather than being a stagnant pond, both for defensive reasons. Stagnant water could be more easily bridged or filled, and for obvious sanitary reasons, since the castle's drainage inevitably found its way into the moat. Many castle moats were fed from diverted streams or rivers, and the engineering required to maintain a reliable water supply for a moat in varying seasonal conditions was itself a significant achievement. The castles that were built on islands, or on promontories almost entirely surrounded by water, occupied an extreme position on the continuum of water-based defence. Mont Saint-Michel, the rocky island off the coast of Normandy that was the site of a famous Benedictine abbey and a significant fortification, was accessible only at low tide and was therefore essentially impregnable to any force that arrived without boats. The abbey fortress sat on top of a conical rock that rose dramatically from the surrounding tidal flats, and the town and fortifications that had grown up around its base by the late medieval period were themselves protected by walls that the surrounding sea made largely redundant for much of the tidal cycle. Mont Saint-Michel survived the 100 Years' War without being taken, a remarkable achievement in a region that was the scene of intense fighting for a century. Caernarfon Castle in Wales was specifically designed to take advantage of its position at the confluence of the River Seine and the Menai Strait, which meant that two sides of the castle were flanked by water. The water gate, which gave access to the castle from the river, allowed the garrison to receive supplies by boat even when the landward approaches were blockaded, exactly the arrangement that allowed Harlech Castle to hold out for 7 years during the Wars of the Roses. The maritime dimension of castle defence is not always given adequate attention in accounts that focus on the land approaches, but for castles on coasts or navigable rivers, the sea and the river were as important a part of the defensive system as the walls and the towers. The men who built them, architects, engineers and craftsmen. The men who designed and built medieval castles have left relatively few personal records, but from the records that survive, building accounts, writs of appointment, references in chronicles, it is possible to construct some picture of who they were and how they worked. Master James of St. George, who designed and supervised the construction of Edward I's Welsh castles in the 1280s and 1290s, is the most fully documented medieval military architect, and the picture that emerges from the records of his career is of a man who combined technical brilliance with organisational genius and political skill. Master James came from Savoy, from the area around what is now Saint-Georges-d'Espéranche, which gives him his surname. He had worked for the Count of Savoy before Edward recruited him, and his experience of castle building in the complex terrain and the intense military environment of the Savoyard borderlands had given him a practical education in military architecture that no school could have provided. When Edward brought him to Wales, he gave him not merely the commission to design castles, but the authority to recruit and direct the enormous workforce that the construction required. At the peak of construction in the mid-1280s, Master James was overseeing a workforce of several thousand men, carpenters, masons, diggers, smiths, and the hundreds of labourers who moved materials, drawn from all over England and Wales, organised into gangs, fed and housed and paid through a supply and financial system that Master James helped to administer. The construction of a major castle was one of the largest and most complex building projects that the medieval world undertook, comparable in organisational complexity to the construction of a great cathedral, but with the added urgency of military necessity pressing against the typical leisurely pace of medieval building. Edward I's Welsh castle programme was conducted in conditions of active military operations, with the castles being built in newly conquered territory where the local population was not reliably loyal, and where the construction site might have to be defended while the construction was in progress. The accounts of the building programme show that the workers were at times issued weapons along with their tools, and that provisions of defensive materials, stakes, beams, rope, were maintained alongside the building materials, ready for use if the worksite came under attack. The quarrymen and the masons who worked the stone were the most skilled element of the castle building workforce. The quarrymen who cut the stone from its geological matrix, in Wales, typically local sandstone and limestone, in some regions the harder igneous rocks that made a more durable, if more difficult building material, were skilled workers who understood the grain of the rock and the techniques of splitting and shaping it that minimized waste and maximized the usable product. The masons who shaped and laid the cut stone were even more specialized, capable of the precise work that the construction of arched doorways, window jambs, fireplace surrounds, and the other decorative and structural elements of the castle required. These men were well paid by medieval standards, and the most skilled of them were in demand across multiple building projects simultaneously, travelling from site to site as their skills were needed. Castle garrisons. The men on the wall. The men who actually lived in castles and defended them were not always the armoured knights of popular imagination. The garrison of a medieval castle consisted of multiple layers of personnel with different functions, different social statuses, and different relationships to the castle and its lord. Understanding the composition of the garrison helps to explain both how castles were defended and why defending them was sometimes more difficult than the physical qualities of the structure alone would suggest. At the top of the garrison hierarchy was the constable, the officer appointed by the castle's lord to command the garrison in the lord's absence. The constable was typically a knight or a senior man-at-arms, a man of military experience and administrative ability, who was trusted to exercise independent judgment in the lord's interest when the lord was elsewhere. The role of the constable was particularly important in the endemic of the period's political and military situation, where the lord might be away for extended periods, on campaign, at court, in diplomatic missions, leaving the constable to manage the castle and its affairs. A good constable was enormously valuable, and the relationship between a lord and his constable was one of the key institutional relationships of medieval military society. Below the constable were the knights who made up the fighting core of the garrison. In a large castle, there might be several knights in permanent residence, along with their squires and personal servants. In smaller castles, there might be only one or two, or none at all, with the garrison's fighting strength drawn entirely from mounted men-at-arms, rather than the full knightly class. The distinction between a knight and a man-at-arms was primarily one of social status and equipment. The knight had received formal investiture with knighthood, and was typically better equipped, but in the confined context of castle defence, both were valuable for the same reasons. They were trained fighters, capable of operating effectively in the restricted spaces of the wall walk and the gatehouse, and they had the physical and psychological toughness to maintain the vigilance and the aggression that successful defence required. The archers were perhaps the most militarily effective members of the garrison, particularly in the period before gunpowder, when archery was the principal long-range weapon. The English longbow archer, the weapon system that would win the battles of Crécy and Agincourt on the open field, was equally valuable in the context of castle defence, where the range and penetrating power of the longbow gave defenders the ability to engage attackers at distances of several hundred yards, and maintain a rate of fire, perhaps 10 to 12 aim shots per minute for a trained archer, that no contemporary weapon could match. Crossbow archers were also standard in castle garrisons, and while the crossbow was slower to reload than the longbow, it required less physical strength to operate, and could be used from the confined positions of the arrow slits with somewhat greater ease. The siege engineer, medieval stem. The siege engineer of the medieval period was one of the most unusual figures in the military landscape of the era. A technical specialist in a world that valued martial virtue above almost everything else. A man whose contribution to military success was intellectual rather than physical. A craftsman who was also a practitioner of what was, by the standards of the time, applied mathematics and applied physics. The construction and operation of a trebuchet required knowledge and skill that was not widely distributed in medieval society. The engineer had to understand the mechanics of the counterweight system well enough to calibrate the machine for the desired range and trajectory, adjusting the length of the throwing arm, the weight of the counterweight, and the length of the sling to achieve the desired effect. He had to understand the properties of the timber being used, which species was strongest, where it was most likely to fail under repeated heavy use, and the metallurgy of the iron fittings that held the machine together. He had to be able to assess the target wall and determine where it was most vulnerable, taking into account the angle of attack, the range, and the likely response of the defenders. All of this required a degree of systematic technical knowledge that was qualitatively different from the empirical battlefield skills of the mounted warrior. The miners who conducted the mining operations that breached so many medieval castle walls were another category of technical specialist, with skills that were transferable from mining in the extractive sense to mining in the military sense. Men who had worked in the lead mines of the Peak District, or the tin mines of Cornwall, or the coal mines of the Rhineland understood tunnel construction, timbering techniques, and the management of underground spaces in ways that could be directly applied to the military problem of undermining a castle wall. The use of actual miners, men who did this professionally in civilian life, in military mining operations is well documented, and their value to a besieging commander was considerable. The crossbow technician who maintained the garrison's crossbows was another specialist whose role is easy to overlook. The crossbow was a precision weapon that required careful maintenance. The string had to be replaced regularly. The mechanism had to be kept clean and lubricated. The bolts had to be straight and properly fletched. And a garrison whose crossbows were poorly maintained was significantly weaker than one whose weapons were in perfect condition. The same applied to the other equipment of the garrison, the armour that needed to be kept free of rust, the swords and pole weapons that needed to be sharp and properly balanced, the siege engines that the garrison maintained for their own defensive use, the 100 Years' War, castles in an age of transformation. The 100 Years' War between England and France, 1337 to 1453, was, among many other things, a laboratory for the evolution of castle warfare, a period during which the defensive value of the castle was tested against the most sustained and sophisticated military pressure that the medieval world had yet applied. The war produced some of the most famous siege operations in history, and it also produced the early gunpowder artillery that would eventually transform the military balance between offensive and defensive operations. The English army that fought the 100 Years' War was one of the most effective military instruments of the medieval period, built around the combination of the longbow and the dismounted man-at-arms that had proven so devastating at Crécy, 1346, Poitiers, 1356, and Agincourt, 1415. But this army, which was almost unbeatable in open battle, found castle warfare frustrating and expensive. The great English victories of the war opened territories to English occupation, But holding those territories required reducing the castles within them, and reducing castles was slow and costly work even for the best army in the world. The French gradually developed their own response to the English military system, partly by avoiding open battle where possible and concentrating instead on castle warfare. The patient reduction of English-held castles through siege and the maintenance of French-held castles against English siege. Jean Bureau, the master of French artillery in the final phase of the war, used the most advanced gunpowder artillery in Europe to systematically reduce the English castles of Normandy in the early 1450s, capturing more than 60 strongholds in a single campaigning season. The speed of Bureau's operations was unprecedented. Castles that might have resisted a pre-artillery siege for months fell in days or weeks to his cannon, and the psychological effect on the English garrisons was enormous. The 100 Years' War ended in France's favour in large part because France had developed a technological advantage in siege warfare that the English could not match. The English castles in France that fell to Bureau's artillery were, in many cases, perfectly well-built medieval fortifications that would have been impregnable against any earlier form of attack. Their vulnerability was not to any failure of design, but to a fundamental change in the technology of attack that had made the design assumptions of the high medieval castle obsolete. The thick stone curtain wall, which had been proof against trebuchet bombardment and against mining, was not proof against gunpowder artillery firing at close range, because the concentrated energy of the gunpowder explosion was qualitatively different from the kinetic energy of a trebuchet stone or the mechanical energy of a mining operation. The castle designers of the late 15th and 16th centuries would have to start again from different assumptions. The castle in society, power, control, and community. The castle's role in medieval society extended far beyond its function as a military installation. It was also the administrative centre of a lord's estate, the judicial seat from which justice was dispensed, the economic hub from which the estate's agricultural and commercial activities were managed, and the social centre from which the cultural life of the elite was conducted. Understanding the castle's multiple social functions helps to explain why it was built and maintained at such enormous cost, even when it was not in any immediate sense under military threat. The castle was the place from which rents were collected, accounts maintained, and disputes adjudicated. The lord's household, the knights who served him, the clerks who managed his administration, the servants who ran the domestic side of his establishment, was based in the castle, and the castle's hall and chambers were the physical setting in which the lord exercised the social and political authority that was the real foundation of his power. A lord without a castle was a lord without a base, without a court, without the physical expression of his authority that medieval society required and expected. Even lords who spent much of their time at the royal court or in diplomatic travel needed their castles as the fixed points of their landed power, the places to which they could return and from which they could not easily be dislodged. The relationship between the castle and the surrounding community was complex and not always hostile. The castle's market. Many castles had associated markets or towns that had grown up in their shadow, benefiting from the protection the castle provided and serving the economic needs of the garrison and household, was a place of commercial exchange that brought the castle and the surrounding population into regular, largely peaceful contact. The castle's chapel was often open to the local population for religious services. The castle's workshops provided goods and services to the surrounding community as well as to the garrison. And the castle's presence as a refuge in times of danger, a place to which the local population could retreat when raiders or armies threatened, was a real and significant benefit that the community received in exchange for the labour services and rents it provided to the lord. The garrison soldier who spent his years in a particular castle became part of the local community in ways that are not always recognised. He worshipped in the local church, married locally if he was not already married, bought goods from local merchants, and participated in the social life of the surrounding town or village. The garrison was not an alien military occupation in most cases, but a relatively well-integrated element of the local social fabric, and the relationship between the castle and its neighbourhood was typically closer and more complex than the image of the castle as an isolated fortress suggests. The decline of the castle, when the walls were no longer enough. The story of the castle's decline is the story of gunpowder, but it is also, less obviously, the story of the centralisation of political power that made the castle's role as an independent centre of military and political authority increasingly problematic for the emerging nation-states of the late medieval and early modern periods. Gunpowder was the technological agent of change. Political consolidation was the social context that made that change permanent. The earliest gunpowder weapons appeared in European warfare in the 14th century, and their initial impact on castle warfare was modest. The cannon of the early 14th century was small, unreliable, and not clearly more effective than a good trebuchet against a stone wall. But the technology improved rapidly, and by the mid-15th century the largest cannon were capable of breaching any existing castle wall in a matter of days. The walls that had been designed to resist the trebuchet, thick at the base but still relatively tall and presenting a vertical face to the bombardment, were highly vulnerable to the lower trajectory fire of the cannon, which struck the wall at a less oblique angle and could more efficiently transfer its energy into the masonry. The response of military architects to the cannon was the Trace Italian, a system of low, thick, angled earthwork bastions that replaced the medieval curtain wall from the late 15th century onward. The Trace Italian was designed specifically to defeat cannon. The low profile reduced the area of wall exposed to fire. The thick earthwork absorbed cannonballs that would shatter stone, and the angled faces of the bastions deflected cannonballs rather than receiving their full force. The great fortresses built in the Trace Italian style, the coastal defences of England built by Henry VIII, the fortifications of the Italian city-states, the frontier fortresses of France, bear no visual resemblance to the great stone towers of the high medieval castle, because they were designed according to entirely different principles. The political dimension of the castle's decline was equally important. The great lords who had built and held castles as the physical expression of their independent military power were, in the late medieval and early modern period, increasingly subject to the authority of centralized monarchies that were unwilling to tolerate the existence of fortifications that could be used against the crown as easily as they could be used in its service. In England, the Tudor monarchs who consolidated their power after the chaos of the Wars of the Roses were suspicious of any magnate who maintained a substantial castle garrison, and the policy of requiring royal licence for castle construction and fortification was a deliberate instrument of political control. In France, the process of royal centralisation was even more systematic. The destruction of the great baronial castles that had maintained the independence of the French nobility was a deliberate royal policy from at least the 13th century, accelerated by the campaigns of the Hundred Years' War and completed in the consolidation of the French state under Louis XI and his successors. By the end of the 15th century, the French nobility was dependent on the crown in a way that their predecessors of the 12th and 13th centuries would have found incomprehensible, and the castle, once the expression of their independence, was becoming a residence and a symbol rather than a genuine military installation. Legends and myths, the castle in memory and story. The castle has been one of the most powerful images in the Western imagination for as long as the Western imagination has existed in anything like its current form, and the stories that medieval people told about castles, the legends that accumulated around famous fortifications, the myths of the impregnable castle and the desperate siege, tell us something important about what the castle meant to the people who lived in its shadow. The legend of the last defender, the man who holds the castle against impossible odds, sustained by loyalty or love or principle, refusing to surrender even when all rational calculation suggests that surrender is the only option, recurs throughout the history of the medieval castle and its afterlife in literature and legend. Roger de Lacy at Chateau Gaillard, William Oliphant at Stirling, Dafydd ap Ieuanion at Harlech. These are historical figures who have been elevated by subsequent tradition into something close to mythological status, because their stubborn, costly, ultimately futile resistance expresses something that people find deeply admirable: the refusal to accept the verdict of overwhelming force, the insistence that there is something worth defending even when the defence becomes hopeless. The Arthurian legend, which is built around the castle, Camelot, the castle that represents the ideal social order, surrounded by the hostile wilderness of an unreformed world, is the supreme expression of the castle's symbolic power in medieval culture. Camelot is not a defensive installation. It is a social order made stone, the physical expression of the values of justice and fellowship and honour that the Round Table represents. Its eventual destruction is not a military defeat, but a moral collapse. The values that the castle expresses are undermined from within, and the castle falls because the community that inhabits it has ceased to deserve it. The resonance of this story, which has survived in some form from its medieval origins to the present day, suggests that the castle's symbolic meaning, as the embodiment of a social order, as the expression of what is worth defending and what it costs to defend it, was understood at a level that went beyond the military and the political. The ghost story is perhaps the most characteristic form of the castle legend, and it is so universal as to be almost a cliché. Every great castle has its ghost, its tragic story of a lady imprisoned in the tower, or a lord betrayed by his garrison, or a child who died in the dungeon. These stories reflect, in their oblique way, the reality of what castles were, places where power was exercised over people's lives in ways that were sometimes brutal, where imprisonment and execution and the whole apparatus of medieval violence were as much a part of the castle's function as the banquets in the great hall. The ghosts that haunt castles are the shadows of that violence, the residue of suffering that stone absorbs and remembers in its own way. The castle in winter, with snow lying on the battlements and ice on the moat and the smoke of the great hall's fire rising straight up in the still cold air, is one of the most evocative images in the entire vocabulary of the medieval past. There is something about the combination of warmth within and cold without, of the fire in the hearth and the wind outside the thick stone walls, that captures the essence of what a castle was, a place of safety in a dangerous world, a human creation that held the cold and the dark and the hostile at bay through the sheer accumulated effort of its builders and the determined will of its defenders. The castle in winter, with its lights in the arrow slits and its smoke against the pale sky, is perhaps the image that best captures why people built these extraordinary structures and what they hoped, when the construction was complete, that they had achieved. The castle at night, a final walk on the walls. It is worth spending a moment in the most intimate possible proximity to the medieval castle. imagining ourselves on the wall walk at midnight, in the middle of a winter that is not a siege but an ordinary winter, when the castle is simply being the castle, doing what it was built to do, which is to exist solidly and permanently, and to make the world a certain way through its existence. The wall walk at midnight is cold. The stone under your feet has absorbed the cold of the day and gives it back at night, and the wind that comes across the battlements from the open countryside beyond the moat finds every gap in your clothing and insinuates itself against your skin. The sentry who paces this wall every night of his garrison life knows its every irregularity, the stone that is slightly higher than the others, the place where the walk narrows as it passes behind a tower, the crenel that has a crack in its base from some impact long since forgotten. He moves through the darkness with the confidence of long practice, his eyes sweeping the black fields below and the dark sky above, looking for anything that should not be there. The moat below him is dark and still. Somewhere in its depth the ice is beginning to form at the edges. It has been cold for several days, and in the morning there will be a thin skin of ice along the banks that the garrison commander will note and assess. A frozen moat is not a compromised moat, not yet, but it is a reminder that the water-based defences of the castle are not unconditional, and that vigilance must be maintained regardless of the season and regardless of the apparent absence of any immediate threat. The torches at the gate burn steadily in the still air. The gate is closed, the portcullis lowered, the drawbridge raised. The gatehouse is manned, as it always is, by men who are awake and armed and watching the approach road that leads away through the darkness toward the town. The town is dark at this hour, its inhabitants asleep, the lights in its windows extinguished. Between the town and the castle there is only the road and the open ground and the moat, and the road and the open ground are empty, as they are expected to be, as they should be. The sentry on the wall looks out at all of this and sees everything that he is supposed to see. Nothing moves. The world is quiet. The castle is what it has always been, what it was built to be, solid, present, watchful. The stone under his feet is the same stone that was laid here by men who worked and planned and argued about the precise placement of each course, who calculated the angle of each tower and the depth of the foundation and the width of the moat. Those men are gone. Their names are mostly lost, but their work is here, and it will still be here long after the sentry has gone to his rest, long after the garrison has been discharged, and the Lord has died, and the world that produced this place has been replaced by another world entirely. The castle at midnight is the most honest version of itself. In the daylight it is also its other things, the administrative centre, the social stage, the economic hub. But at midnight, reduced to its essential function, it is simply a defensive work, stone and space and vigilance, holding against the darkness, holding against whatever the darkness might contain. Castle chapels and the sacred life within stone walls. Every significant medieval castle had its chapel, and the chapel's presence within the defensive perimeter was not merely a concession to the religious requirements of the garrison, but an expression of the fundamental conviction of the medieval world that the sacred and the martial were inseparably linked. The castle and the chapel, the sword and the cross, were the two instruments through which the medieval lord held his world together, and the architecture of the castle reflected this understanding in the placement and the elaboration of the chapel space. The chapel in a large castle was not a modest room, but a genuine architectural achievement, often one of the most carefully decorated spaces in the entire complex. The Chapel of St. John in the White Tower of London, which dates from the original Norman construction of the late 11th century, is one of the finest surviving examples of Norman chapel architecture in Britain. Its two-aisled nave, its rounded apse, its simple but deeply harmonious proportions. All of this was created within the walls of a military installation by builders who were simultaneously engaged in the most ruthlessly practical problem of constructing an impregnable fortress. The combination of military pragmatism and genuine architectural refinement in the same building is characteristic of the high medieval castle at its best. The daily religious observances within the castle, the Mass celebrated at the chapel's altar each morning, the canonical hours marked by the ringing of the chapel bell, the seasonal ceremonies of the liturgical year, gave the castle's social life a rhythm and a structure that complemented the military routine of the watch. The garrison that began its day with Mass was a garrison that had been reminded, before it took up its weapons and its defensive positions, of the larger context in which its service was understood, the defense of a Christian order against those who would overthrow it, the fulfillment of a duty that was as much spiritual as it was martial. The priest who served the chapel was therefore a figure of genuine importance in the castle community, not merely as a spiritual counsellor, but as the person who maintained the framework of meaning within which the garrison understood its work. In times of siege, the chapel took on an even more urgent importance. The garrison that was holding against a determined attacker needed more than military skill and physical endurance. It needed the conviction that what it was doing was right and meaningful, and the chapel was the place where that conviction was maintained and renewed. The daily Mass during a siege was an act of communal affirmation, a statement that the community within the walls was holding together, spiritually as well as physically, and that its defence was grounded in something more durable than mere military calculation. The chronicles of famous sieges frequently note the religious observances maintained by the garrison, and the implication is always that these observances were an important part of the garrison's ability to hold on. Food, feasting, and the dynamics of the Great Hall. The Great Hall was the centre of the castle's social life, this space in which the complex hierarchy of the medieval household was most visibly performed. The hall was large, in the greatest castles it might be 100 feet long, and its organisation reflected the social order with complete precision. The lord sat at the high table on its raised dais at one end, flanked by his family and honoured guests. Below the salt, the great salt cellar that divided the high table from the rest, sat the knights and men-at-arms and senior household officials. Further down the hall sat the lesser household members, the squires, the clerks, the senior servants. At the far end, closest to the kitchens, sat the lowest members of the household. This arrangement, which was as rigid and as symbolically loaded as any court ceremony, was enacted twice a day at the major meals, reinforcing the social structure of the castle community every time food was served. The food served in the castle hall, in peacetime before the constraints of siege rationing reduced everyone to salt meat and hard bread, was a reflection of the lord's wealth and status. The great lords of the high medieval period maintained households of dozens or hundreds of people, and feeding them was a significant logistical and financial undertaking. The castle's kitchen, often a separate building from the main structure, to reduce the risk of fire spreading to the residential quarters, was a busy and well-organised operation, staffed by specialists: the master cook, the saucier, the pastry cook, the poulterer, the butler who managed the wine and ale. The meals produced by this establishment were not merely for nourishment but for display. The elaborate dishes, the decorative presentation, the sheer quantity and variety of food were all signals of the lord's resources and his generosity, which was one of the cardinal virtues of the medieval aristocracy. The contrast between the feast in the Great Hall and the rations of a garrison under siege was therefore not merely a practical difference but a symbolic one. The abundance of the feast demonstrated the castle's strength and the lord's power. The rationing of the siege demonstrated the limits of that power and the vulnerability of the community within the walls. A garrison commander who maintained reasonable rations for as long as possible was not merely attending to the physical needs of his men, but managing the symbolic dimension of the castle's predicament. As long as the men ate adequately, the castle retained something of its peacetime dignity. When the rations fell below adequacy, that dignity was compromised, and with it some portion of the garrison's confidence and resolve. The horse in castle warfare, cavalry, sorties, and the mounted knight, the relationship between the medieval castle and the horse, is one that is easy to overlook but fundamental to understanding how the castle functioned as a military institution. The castle was not merely a passive defensive installation, it was the base from which mounted military operations were conducted, and the horses that made those operations possible were as essential to the castle's military function as the walls themselves. A castle without horses was a castle that could not send out cavalry patrols, could not conduct effective sorties against a besieging force, could not pursue a retreating enemy. It was, in effect, a castle that had surrendered the initiative to its opponents, and were entirely dependent on the quality of its passive defences. The stabling of horses within the castle walls was therefore a first-order consideration of castle design. The bailey, the courtyard within the curtain wall, had to be large enough to accommodate the number of horses that the castle's garrison required, along with the hay and grain needed to feed them, and the grooms and farriers and saddlers needed to maintain them. The horses of a major medieval castle might number in the dozens or even hundreds, and their presence within the walls was a significant logistical commitment that affected everything from the amount of space available for other purposes to the quantity of provisions required to sustain the garrison during a siege. The horse in a siege context was both an asset and a liability. As an asset, the horse gave the garrison the ability to conduct the mounted sorties that were one of its most important tactical tools, allowing fast-moving cavalry to attack enemy siege equipment, disrupt enemy mining operations, and generally remind the besieging force that the garrison was not merely waiting to be starved out, but was actively contesting the siege. As a liability, the horse consumed large quantities of food that might otherwise sustain the garrison's human defenders, and as the siege wore on and provisions became scarce, the decision of when to slaughter the horses for food rather than maintain them for military purposes was one of the more difficult calculations a garrison commander had to make. The war horse, the destrier, the great horse that carried the armoured knight in battle, was among the most expensive military equipment of the medieval period. A good destrier might cost as much as a year's income for a prosperous knight, and the loss of a destrier in a siege was a significant financial blow as well as a military one. Knights who had brought their own horses into a castle when they took up garrison duty were therefore particularly motivated to preserve those animals, and the tension between this personal interest and the military logic of the garrison situation, which might require the horses to be risked in sorties or eventually consumed as food, was a real feature of the garrison's internal politics. The role of treachery, castles lost from within. Many of the castles that fell in the medieval period fell not through direct military assault but through treachery, through the action of someone inside the castle who opened a gate, passed information to the enemy, or otherwise assisted the attacker in a way that overcame the purely physical defences. The frequency of treachery in medieval siege warfare is one of the aspects of the period that is most striking to modern observers, and it reflects something important about the nature of medieval society and the conditions of castle life that made treachery both thinkable and practicable. The castle was a hierarchical community in which relationships of loyalty and service were the governing social bonds, but those relationships were not always secure. The garrison soldier who had not been paid for months, who saw no prospect of relief, who'd been told by captured prisoners that the besieging commander was offering generous terms to anyone who facilitated a surrender. This man was facing a calculation that pure military loyalty alone might not resolve in favour of continued resistance. The pages who moved in and out of the castle carrying messages, the servants who maintained the household, the local craftsmen who might have been inside the walls when the siege began, any of these might be susceptible to the approaches of an enemy intelligence operation if the conditions of the siege were severe enough, and the inducements offered were attractive enough. The most famous act of treachery in English castle history is perhaps the surrender of the castle of Bristol in 1326, when the garrison opened the gates to Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer's forces after token resistance, abandoning their commitment to Edward II at the moment when the political winds changed decisively. This was treachery in a purely formal sense. The garrison had given an oath to defend the castle for its lord, but it was also a rational political calculation in a situation where the political order that the oath had served was clearly collapsing. Medieval loyalty was conditional in ways that modern contract law is not, and the garrison soldier who changed sides when the balance of power shifted was acting within a set of norms that were more flexible than the formal language of oaths and obligations suggests. The castle's internal security, the measures taken to prevent treachery and to detect it before it could be acted upon, was an important aspect of the garrison commander's responsibilities. Control of the keys was the most fundamental measure. The keys to the gates and the portcullises and the postern doors were typically kept by the constable personally or by an officer of absolute trust. Control of communications was equally important. Messages sent from the castle to the outside and received from the outside were monitored, at least in principle, and the garrison's contact with the besieging force was managed through formal negotiating sessions rather than informal individual contact. But complete control was impossible in a community of dozens or hundreds of people, and the garrison commander who maintained adequate security while also maintaining the trust and the morale of his men was performing a genuinely difficult balancing act. The economics of castle maintenance, who paid and who bled. The economic reality of castle ownership in the medieval period was a constant pressure on the lords who held these expensive establishments. Building a castle was costly. Maintaining it in a state of military readiness was also costly, and staffing it with a garrison capable of defending it effectively was the most continuous and most unavoidable expense of all. The castle that was allowed to fall into disrepair, its walls crumbling, its moat silted up, its garrison reduced to a skeleton crew, was a castle that was no longer performing its defensive function and was therefore not worth the continued investment of the resources it still consumed. The English royal castle accounts that survive from the 13th and 14th centuries give us a detailed picture of what castle maintenance actually cost. Wages for the garrison, constable, knights, men-at-arms, archers, crossbowmen, watchmen, grooms, and a miscellany of skilled and unskilled workers were the largest single expense. Food and fuel for the garrison were the next largest. Maintenance of the physical structure, the constant repair of walls damaged by weather and neglect, the replacement of timber elements that rotted, the maintenance of the machinery of the gates and bridges was a third major category. Keeping a significant castle in proper working order might cost several £100s a year, at a time when a prosperous knight's annual income was perhaps £20 to £30. Only the crown and the greatest lords could afford to maintain multiple major castles without serious financial strain. The financial relationship between the crown and its castle-holding lords was one of the structural tensions of medieval government. The king needed the castles on his frontiers and in strategically important locations to be maintained in defensible condition, because those castles were the physical infrastructure of royal power. But he did not always have the resources to pay for their maintenance himself, and the obligation he placed on the lords who held them created a continuous source of friction. Lords who were required to maintain expensive castles from their own resources were lords who had less money for other things, for building up their own power, for making the kind of political trouble that kings preferred to prevent. The castle that was surrendered without adequate resistance was not merely a military failure, but a financial and political one. The resources that had been invested in its construction and maintenance over decades or centuries were lost at a stroke, along with whatever strategic advantages its location had provided. The lord who lost a castle through inadequate defence might be required to pay for the consequences of that loss in ways that went beyond military humiliation, through fines, through the loss of further estates, through the political disgrace that followed the failure to protect what had been entrusted to his care. This financial and political context gave the defence of castles an urgency that went beyond pure military logic and explains, in part, why garrison commanders sometimes held on to the point of desperation rather than accepting the rational option of surrender. Arrow slits and crossbows, the mechanics of castle defence. The technology of projectile weapons and the architectural features designed to allow their use from within the castle walls were in a state of continuous coevolution throughout the medieval period. The arrow slit that we've already described in its basic form underwent significant refinement over the centuries, as castle builders attempted to give the archers and crossbowmen inside the castle the maximum possible field of fire while maintaining the maximum possible protection against return fire. The cross-shaped arrow slit, which added a horizontal opening to the vertical slot, creating a cross-shaped aperture, was developed in the late 12th and 13th centuries to allow archers shooting from the slit to engage targets to the side as well as directly in front of them. The oilet, a circular hole at the base of the vertical slot, allowed the archer to depress the angle of his shot, engaging targets directly below the slit rather than only those at a distance. These modifications seem small, but their tactical significance was considerable. A wall that was defended by cross-shaped arrow slits with oilets could engage targets across a much wider arc than one with simple vertical slits, reducing the number of dead zones that an attacker could exploit. The crossbow was particularly well suited to use from within castle defences because of its mechanical consistency and its penetrating power. The crossbow was wound, or spanned, in the terminology of the period, using a mechanical device, a lever, a wheel, or a belt hook depending on the power of the bow. The spanning process took time, but it required relatively little physical strength compared to the drawing of a longbow, which meant that crossbowmen could maintain effective fire from the enclosed positions of arrow slits and covered galleries with less fatigue than longbow archers. The crossbow bolt fired at high velocity over relatively short ranges was also more accurate than a longbow arrow in the hands of a moderately trained shooter, making it well adapted to the kind of precise, targeted shooting that castle defence often required. The development of cannon as a defensive weapon, cannon mounted within the castle to engage attacking forces, was an early adaptation of the new technology that castle commanders made almost as soon as the technology became available. The earliest cannon were small and unreliable, but even a small cannon mounted above a gate passage or on a corner tower had a psychological effect on attackers that considerably exceeded its practical lethal capability. The sound of cannon fire from within a castle was a signal that the garrison was equipped with the latest military technology, which implied resources and confidence that might make an attacker think twice about the cost of the siege. Castles of the sea, coastal fortifications and their unique challenges. The coastal castle occupied a special position in the landscape of medieval fortification, because it faced a threat that differed fundamentally from the threats against which inland castles were designed. The inland castle had to defend against armies that travelled by road, whose approach could be observed from a distance, and whose movements were constrained by the need to keep supply lines open. The coastal castle had to defend against forces that could arrive suddenly from the sea, that could choose their landing point freely within the range of their ships, and that could carry supplies with them rather than depending on a fixed supply line. Dover Castle, which commanded the strait between England and France, and was therefore the most strategically important castle in England for much of the medieval period, illustrates the particular challenges of coastal defence. Its position on the white cliffs above the channel meant that it could observe any fleet approaching the Kent coast, giving it early warning of attack. Its elevation gave it a commanding field of fire over the town of Dover and the harbour below. But its position also meant that it could not prevent a landing on the beaches some distance away, and the castle's strategic function was as much about controlling the port and the approach to London as about actually defending the strait against naval attack. The coastal castle of the later medieval and early modern period, the artillery fortresses that Henry VIII of England built along the southern coast of England in the late 1530s and 1540s in response to the threat of a Catholic invasion following his break with Rome, represented a specific adaptation to the combined challenges of naval attack and gunpowder artillery. Deal Castle, Walmer Castle, Camber Castle. These squat, round, cloverleaf fortifications were designed specifically to mount artillery at multiple levels, to provide all-round fire across the beaches and the sea approaches, and to be extremely difficult to hit with naval artillery because of their low profile. They were in many ways the last expression of the logic of castle design in the British Isles, before fortification design moved entirely into the domain of military engineering rather than architecture. The inner world, castle gardens, storerooms, and the domestic machinery. The popular image of the medieval castle is overwhelmingly military. Walls and towers and gates and the grim apparatus of defence. But the castle was also, for the people who lived in it, a home, and the domestic machinery of the castle, the kitchens and the storerooms and the gardens and the stables and the workshops, was as essential to its function as the battlements. A castle that could not sustain its inhabitants in reasonable comfort during peacetime would not be able to sustain them at all during a siege, and the domestic infrastructure of the castle was an integral part of its defensive system. The garden was a feature of castle life that is often overlooked in accounts that focus on the military aspects. Many castles maintained gardens within their walls, herb gardens, vegetable gardens, sometimes small orchards, that served both practical and aesthetic purposes. The practical purposes were obvious. Fresh herbs and vegetables supplemented the diet of the garrison and the household in ways that preserved provisions were unable to do, and the herbs in particular were essential for the medical and culinary arts that the castle's domestic operations required. The aesthetic purposes were equally important in a world where the enclosed garden was understood as a place of order and cultivation, a controlled version of the wild nature outside the walls that expressed the castle's domesticating function. The storerooms of a well-managed castle were among the most important spaces in the entire complex, because the stores they contained were the measure of the castle's ability to endure a siege. The grain stored in the cellar, the wheat and rye and oats that would become the bread and porridge that sustained the garrison, was calculated in weeks and months of supply, and the castle's constable or steward was responsible for maintaining those calculations and ensuring that the stores were replenished before they fell below a safe level. The salted meat in its barrels, the dried fish in its chests, the oil in its jars, the wine and ale in their casks. All of this was the accumulated insurance of a community that understood, from long experience, that the moment when you needed your stores was always the moment when replenishment was impossible. The smithy was another essential element of the castle's domestic infrastructure. The smith who maintained the garrison's weapons and armour, keeping the swords sharp and the armour rust-free and the crossbow mechanisms functioning, was as important to the castle's defensive capability as the archer who used those weapons. The smith also maintained the hardware of the castle itself, the iron hinges and locks of the gates, the chains and rings of the portcullis mechanism, the iron-tipped shafts of the crossbow bolts. A castle whose smith had been killed or incapacitated would find its defensive capacity gradually degrading as weapons and mechanisms wore out and could not be repaired, and the smith's workshop, with its forge and its bellows and its tools, was therefore a space that was worth protecting almost as carefully as the gate. The outer works, barbicans, gatehouses, and the extended defence. The gatehouse of a major medieval castle was, as we have noted, often the most heavily defended section of the entire fortification, a fortress within a fortress, designed to repel any attack that concentrated on the inevitable vulnerability of the gate. But beyond the gatehouse itself, the most sophisticated castle designers extended the defensive perimeter outward through a series of outer works that multiplied the obstacles an attacker had to overcome before reaching the main gate. The barbican, the outer gatehouse that defended the approach to the main gate, might be as elaborate as a small castle in itself, with its own portcullis and drawbridge, its own murder holes and arrow slits, its own garrison of archers and men-at-arms. An attacker who took the barbican had not entered the castle. He had entered the killing ground between the barbican and the main gate, a space that was designed to be as dangerous as any other part of the approach. The barbicans of Caernarfon and Harlech castles in Wales were particularly elaborate examples of this concept, each designed to channel any attacking force into a narrow, exposed corridor that was entirely overlooked by the defensive works above. The forebuilding that protected the entrance to many great Norman keeps served a similar function. The forebuilding was a structure attached to the exterior of the keep, enclosing the external staircase that gave access to the keep's first-floor entrance. To enter the keep, an attacker had to first take the forebuilding, and the forebuilding was designed to make this as difficult as possible. The forebuilding of Rochester Castle in Kent, which dates from the early 12th century, enclosed the staircase in a stone structure that was itself defensible, with its own gate and its own positions for defensive fire. It added another layer of delay and another expenditure of attacking resources between the outer ward and the inner sanctuary of the keep. The concept of defence in depth, multiple layers of obstacles, each one designed to channel the attacker into a position where he was vulnerable to the next layer of defence, was the organising principle of the best medieval castle design. Defence in depth meant that overcoming any single obstacle did not give the attacker a decisive advantage. It gave him access to the next obstacle, and the next, and the next. The attacker who finally breached the outer wall found himself in the outer ward facing the inner wall. The attacker who scaled the inner wall found himself in the inner ward facing the keep. The attacker who battered his way into the keep found himself in a dark, thick-walled building with no windows at the lower levels, its staircases wound to favour defenders, its upper stories still held by men who were fighting for everything they had. Defence in depth turned the fall of each successive line of defence into a new beginning for the defence, a new problem for the attacker to solve at renewed cost. The walls speak. Stone records of medieval violence. The physical evidence preserved in the stones of surviving medieval castles is, in many cases, the most direct and most eloquent testimony we have to the violence that those structures were built to manage. Arrow marks in gatehouse walls, repairs in curtain walls that date from specific siege events, the remains of fire damage in towers that experienced attack, all of these are the direct physical record of the castle's history as a military installation, written in the language of stone and mortar rather than in words. Rochester Castle bears perhaps the most dramatic physical evidence of medieval siege violence in Britain. The Keep of Rochester was besieged by King John in 1215, during the first phase of the First Barons' War, and John's engineers managed to mine one corner of the keep, causing the collapse of the corner tower. The collapse was repaired after the siege, but it was repaired in a different architectural style. The original square corner tower was replaced with a round tower, which was more resistant to future mining attempts. The two architectural styles of the keep, 3 square corners and 1 round, are still clearly visible today, a lasting physical record of the crisis of 1215 and the specific lesson that the defenders drew from it about which architectural forms were most resistant to underground attack. Château Gaillard in Normandy, though now a magnificent ruin rather than a working castle, preserves in its surviving walls the evidence of Philip II's siege of 1203 to 1204. The gaps and collapses in the outer walls record the work of the French mining teams. The surviving sections of the inner walls, still standing to considerable height despite 8 centuries of neglect, testify to the quality of the original construction. Standing within the ruins today, on the rock above the Seine that Richard I chose with such care, looking out over the river valley below, it is possible to reconstruct the geometry of the siege with considerable accuracy, to see exactly where the French engineers worked and how the defenders responded in a way that no written account can quite match. The graffiti left by prisoners in castle dungeons is another form of physical evidence that speaks directly from the medieval past. The walls of the Beauchamp Tower at the Tower of London, where prisoners of state were confined from the 13th century onward, are covered with inscriptions carved by captives using whatever tools they could improvise, recording their names, their heraldic devices, their expressions of faith and of despair. These inscriptions are not military history in the conventional sense, but they are a direct record of the human experience of the castle's coercive power, of what it meant to be on the losing side of the medieval power struggle, and to find oneself confined within the very walls that had seemed, from the outside, to express invincibility. Famous castle builders, their vision and their legacy. The history of medieval castle building is also the history of the individuals, kings, lords, master masons, military engineers, whose vision and determination and resources produced the structures that have survived to the present day. Understanding something of these individuals helps to explain the distinctive character of the castles they built, and the specific strategic and personal calculations that shaped their design choices. Richard I of England, Richard Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, was one of the most personally engaged castle builders of the medieval period, a king who combined military genius with a genuine understanding of military architecture and who was directly involved in the design of his fortifications rather than merely commissioning them from specialists. Chateau Gaillard was his masterpiece, and contemporary accounts suggest that he worked closely with his engineers on its design, proposing innovations and overriding conventional approaches in ways that reflected his own tactical thinking. The round towers of Chateau Gaillard, the carefully calculated relationship between the outer and inner wards, the use of the river cliff as an integral element of the defence, all of these bear the marks of a military mind that is thinking about the specific problem of this specific site and this specific strategic situation, rather than simply applying a standard formula. Edward I of England was another king who combined military and administrative genius with a specific interest in castle architecture, and his Welsh castle building programme was the most systematic and most expensive royal castle building enterprise in British history. Edward's approach was comprehensive. He did not merely commission castles but planned their strategic deployment as an integrated system, positioning them to control river crossings, coastal landing points, and the principal routes through the Welsh landscape in a way that made the subjugation of Wales as much an architectural achievement as a military one. The castles of Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, Beaumaris, and the others were not independent fortifications but elements of a designed strategic landscape, and their placement was the product of careful strategic analysis that reflects the systematic military thinking that characterized Edward's entire reign. Philip II of France, Philip Augustus, built his own ring of castles to defend the newly acquired territories of northern France following his victories over the English in the first decade of the 13th century, and his castles, the Louvre in Paris, originally built as a castle rather than a palace, the castles of the Loire Valley, the fortifications of the Normandy coast, reflect a different set of strategic priorities than the English castles. Philip's castles were designed not merely for local defence, but as elements of a national defensive system, positioned to screen the approaches to Paris and to control the key river routes that any invader of France would have to use. The Chateau Gaillard that Philip took in 1204 was, from this perspective, the most important strategic objective in Normandy, and Philip's willingness to invest an entire year and enormous resources in its reduction reflects his understanding that the castle was not merely a military challenge, but a symbol of English power that had to be overcome for his territorial ambitions to be fully realized. The Crusades and the Castle, fortification at the edge of the known world. The Crusades, the series of military expeditions launched by the papacy and conducted by the knights of Western Europe against the Muslim powers of the Holy Land and the Eastern Mediterranean between 1096 and the late 13th century, created the most extreme military environment that Western castle building ever had to respond to. The Crusader lords who settled in the territories captured by the First Crusade held small, isolated outposts of Christian military power in the midst of an Islamic world that was, in the long run, overwhelmingly stronger than they were. Their survival for nearly 2 centuries depended in large part on the quality of their fortifications. The strategic logic of the Crusader fortification system was dictated by the geography and the demography of the Holy Land. The Crusader population was always too small to defend the entire territory it nominally controlled through field armies alone. The burden of defence had to be carried by static fortifications that could hold against numerically superior forces for extended periods without needing reinforcement. This requirement drove the Crusader lords and the military orders to build the most sophisticated defensive works of the medieval period, drawing on Byzantine and Islamic models as well as the Western European tradition they had brought with them, and producing fortifications that were in some respects more advanced than anything then being built in the West. The military orders, particularly the Hospitallers and the Templars, were the most important institutional builders in the Crusader states, because their organizational structure gave them capabilities that individual lords could not match. The orders had a permanent professional garrison that was not subject to feudal service limitations. They had a continuous income from their European land holdings and from the donations of pious Christians across Europe. They had an institutional memory that persisted across the deaths of individual officers, allowing them to maintain and improve their castles over decades and centuries without the disruption that changes of lordship caused in secular establishments. And they had the specific military expertise, developed through continuous operational experience, that allowed them to identify and address the weaknesses in their fortifications before those weaknesses were exploited by an enemy. The castle of Markab in the hills above the Syrian coast, was perhaps even more impressively situated than the Krak. Its walls incorporated the hardest black basalt of the surrounding hills, a material that was extremely difficult to mine or to batter through, and its position on a high spur with steep drops on three sides made approach possible only from the south, where the Hospitallers constructed their most elaborate defences. Margat resisted numerous Muslim attacks before finally falling to a Mamluk siege in 1285, not to assault, but to a mining operation that the Hospitaller garrison was forced to acknowledge was beyond their ability to counter. Even then, the Mamluk commander, impressed by the garrison's resistance, reportedly invited the knights to witness his mining before they surrendered, to show them that their position was genuinely untenable. They surrendered under honourable terms and were allowed to withdraw, a gesture of professional respect between opponents who both understood that the castle had been defended with everything its garrison had. The Night Watch, vigilance as a way of life. The watch, the continuous rotation of sentries around the walls and gates of the castle, was the most fundamental single element of castle defence, the practice without which all the engineering and the architecture and the weapons and the provisions were ultimately useless. A castle that was watched was a castle that could not be surprised. A castle that was not watched was a castle that had already begun to fall, regardless of the quality of its walls. The organisation of the watch was one of the garrison commander's most important administrative responsibilities. The watch had to cover every section of the wallwalk, every tower, every gate, at every hour of the day and night, in every weather condition, across the entire duration of the siege or the peacetime occupation. The men who performed the watch were not, in the main, the knights and men-at-arms who would do the fighting in the event of an assault. They were the less prestigious watchmen who were employed specifically for this purpose, men whose job was not to fight but to see and to report. The watchman who went to sleep on duty, who was distracted from his vigil by conversation or by the fatigue of a long watch, was the single most dangerous security vulnerability in the entire castle system. The castle regulations that survive from the medieval period, the ordinances governing the conduct of garrisons that were issued by kings and constables as administrative documents, give a vivid picture of the standards to which watchmen were held. Sleeping on watch was a capital offence in some jurisdictions, though the execution of a watchman who had fallen asleep was probably rare in practice. The deterrent effect of the punishment was more practically important than its actual application. The regular inspection of the watch by the constable or his deputies, the night rounds during which an officer would walk the wall walk and check that each watchman was at his post and alert, was a standard element of garrison routine, and the officer who conducted his rounds conscientiously was providing an essential quality control function that the security of the whole castle depended upon. The signal systems that allowed the watch to communicate threats across the castle's perimeter were simple but effective. Shouted alarms, horn calls, the ringing of the chapel bell, these were the communications technology of the medieval garrison, and their effectiveness depended on the alertness of the men who initiated them and the training of the men who responded. A garrison that had rehearsed its response to specific alerts, the horn call for a mining operation, the bell for a general assault, the shouted warning for a specific section of the wall, could mobilize its defensive resources rapidly even from a standing start. A garrison that had not rehearsed, that had to figure out what was happening and what to do about it in the middle of a crisis, was a garrison that had already lost some of the advantages that its walls gave it. The long nights of the watch, the cold hours between midnight and dawn when the sentry's footsteps were the only sound in the sleeping castle, when the fields below the walls were invisible in the darkness and the stars above were the only company, had a quality of meditative solitude that the chronicles and the military manuals do not record, but that must have been a real and significant feature of garrison life. The man who spent his nights on the walls of a medieval castle year after year, watching the slow rotation of the seasons and the slow turn of the stars above the battlements, was in a relationship with that particular piece of stone and sky that was as intimate and as specific as any relationship with a place can be. The castle was his work and his home and his responsibility, and he knew it in the way that only long, intimate, solitary attention can produce. The medieval castle shaped the world in ways that are still visible if you know where to look, in the geography of modern cities, many of which grew up in the shadow of castles that defined the first settlement, in the political institutions of the nation-states that replaced the castle-based feudal order, and in the cultural imagination of a civilization that is still, after all these centuries, telling stories about these extraordinary structures. The geography of medieval castle building determined the geography of medieval settlement in ways that are still legible in the landscape. Castles were built where they needed to be, at river crossings, at mountain passes, at coastal landing points, in the centres of productive agricultural territories, and towns grew up around them, because the castle provided protection, and the castle's garrison provided a market for local goods. Many of the towns and cities of modern England, France, Germany and Spain began as the settlements that clustered in the shadow of a castle, growing gradually from a few houses to a market town to a city over the course of centuries, while the castle that had been their origin shrank in relative importance and eventually became a ruin or a tourist attraction. Windsor Castle, which began as a motte and bailey foundation of William the Conqueror and grew through 900 years of continuous royal occupation into the largest inhabited castle in the world, is perhaps the most dramatic example of the castle's capacity to persist and adapt. Windsor has been a royal residence, a prison, a military headquarters, a place of refuge in wartime, and a ceremonial stage for some of the most important events in British history. It has been rebuilt, expanded and modified in almost every century since its founding, and yet it retains the essential character of a castle. The high round tower at its centre, the enclosing walls, the sense of a defended space separate from the ordinary world outside, that its founder intended when he chose the chalk spur above the Thames for his first fortification. The political legacy of the castle is more complex and more ambiguous. The castle was, in the purest sense, an instrument of power, a device for concentrating and projecting authority over a specific territory. The lords who built and held castles were not merely providing defensive services to their communities. They were also asserting control over these communities, extracting rents and labour services, and maintaining the social order that their own privilege required. The castle was simultaneously a protection for the surrounding population and an instrument of their subjugation, and any honest account of what castles meant in medieval society has to acknowledge both dimensions of this reality. The transition from the castle-based feudal order to the centralized monarchies of the early modern period was, in part, the story of the great lords' castles being superseded by the royal arsenal, the national artillery train that the French crown developed in the 15th century and that the Tudor monarchs maintained in England. When the king had cannon powerful enough to breach any baronial castle wall, the castle ceased to be an instrument of political independence and became instead a luxury residence or a royal prison. The process by which the English and French crown reduced the military power of their great lords was inseparable from their ability to demonstrate credibly that any castle that defied them could be reduced. The castle that had once been the guarantor of a lord's independence became, in the new political world, a guarantee of nothing but the cost of its maintenance. The cultural legacy of the medieval castle is richer and stranger than its political legacy. The castle has become, in the popular imagination of the Western world, one of the most potent and most versatile symbols available, appearing in fairy tales and fantasy novels and video games and films in forms that range from the historically precise to the entirely fantastical, serving as the setting for stories of romance and adventure and horror and political intrigue. This proliferation of the castle as a cultural symbol suggests that the thing itself, the basic concept of a fortified place, a defended space, a stone boundary between the protected and the unprotected, answers to something fundamental in human experience, something that has not ceased to be relevant even in a world where the castle as a military installation has been obsolete for 5 centuries. The fantasy castle, the soaring towers, the dragon perched on the highest battlement, the princess in the highest room, is descended from the real castle through a process of simplification and amplification that has preserved the emotional content while abandoning the historical specificity. The fantasy castle is tall and imposing and beautiful and dangerous and mysterious, all of which are qualities that the real medieval castle also had, even if it expressed them through thick stone walls and carefully calculated fields of fire rather than through magical enchantments. The connection between the two is not merely superficial. The fantasy castle exists because the real castle was extraordinary enough to leave an impression in the cultural imagination that has not faded in 500 years of obsolescence. We have spent a long time tonight within these walls, walking the parapets, descending into the dungeons, standing at the murder holes, watching the siege engines assemble in the fields below. We have followed the progress of sieges that lasted days, and sieges that lasted years. We've inhabited the minds of the garrison commanders who lay awake in their cold chambers, calculating the dwindling stores and the deepening hunger of their men, and we've tried to understand the extraordinary calculus of stone and strategy and human determination that made medieval castles so nearly impossible to conquer. What have we found? We have found, first of all, that the near impregnability of the medieval castle was not an accident or a lucky byproduct of their construction. It was an achievement, a deliberate, expensive, technically sophisticated achievement that was the product of centuries of accumulated experience with the specific problem of how to make a place that could not easily be taken. Every feature of a mature medieval castle, the height of the walls, the projection of the towers, the depth of the moat, the sequence of gates and portcullises and murder holes, was there because someone, at some point in the long history of castle building, had identified a vulnerability and found a way to address it. We have found that the near impregnability of the castle was also a product of the particular conditions of medieval warfare. The limitations on the size of armies that feudal service obligations imposed, the fragility of supply lines, the devastating effect of disease on besieging forces, the financial constraints that limited how long any attacker could maintain a large force in the field. The castle was not impregnable in any absolute sense. It was impregnable relative to the means available to any attacker who was not prepared to commit unlimited resources for unlimited time, and those were conditions that very few attackers could meet for very long before some other consideration pulled their army away. We have found that the castles which fell, the Chateau Gaillards and the Stirlings and the Acres, fell not because their walls were weak, but because the people inside them were ultimately human. Human in their need for food and water and sleep. Human in their capacity for fear and despair and bad judgment. Human in their vulnerability to the accumulated pressure of months or years of confinement and hardship. The castle could protect its garrison from arrows and fire and mining operations. It could not protect them from their own hunger, or their own doubt, or the knowledge that no relief was coming. We have found too that the castle was more than a military installation. It was a social institution, a political statement, a cultural object. It was the physical expression of the feudal order, of the relationship between lord and vassal, between the protected and the protecting, between the powerful and the dependent, and its meaning was inseparable from that social context. When the social context changed, when the centralized monarchies of the early modern period made the independent military power of the great lords obsolete, the castle changed too, becoming first a luxury residence and then a ruin, and then a monument, a place where we go to remember what power looked like when it was built in stone. The ruins that remain today, and there are thousands of them, scattered across the landscapes of Europe and the Levant and the Crusader states and the Baltic, standing in fields and on cliff tops and above rivers, their stone wearing slowly in the rain, are perhaps the most eloquent testimony to the achievement they represent. They have been standing, most of them, for between 500 and 900 years, through wars and revolutions and the entire transformation of the world that produced them. They were built to last, and they have lasted, even in their diminished and ruined state, far beyond anything that their builders could reasonably have expected. The stone of a castle has a particular texture under the hand, cool and slightly rough, with the traces of the tools that shaped it still just barely visible if you look closely. The mason who cut this stone is gone. The lord who ordered it to be cut is gone. The garrison that occupied the finished walls, the besieging army that tried and perhaps failed to overcome them, the community that sheltered in their shadow, all gone. But the stone is here, and it carries something of all of them. Not their words or their faces or the sound of their voices, but something more fundamental. The weight of their intention, the evidence of their labour, the testimony of their determination to make something permanent in a world that was always, like our world, essentially impermanent. The medieval castle was nearly impossible to conquer because the people who built it understood, at the deepest level, what they were defending and what it was worth. They were not merely defending a building or a piece of land. They were defending a way of life, a social order, a set of relationships and obligations that gave their world its shape and its meaning, and they defended it with everything they had, with the thickness of their walls and the depth of their moats, and the ingenuity of their engineers and the stubbornness of their garrisons and the simple, irrefutable fact of the stone itself, which does not move when you push against it, which does not yield when you press it, which simply stands. There is something in that quality, the quality of standing, of simply being there, of refusing to yield, that we still recognize and still admire even now, when the practical necessity that produced it is long past. The castle on its hill, weathered and partial and inhabited now only by jackdaws and the occasional visiting scholar, is still standing. Whatever came against it, whatever tried to bring it down, it is still standing. And in the stillness of a late evening, with the light going out of the sky and the mist beginning to form in the valley below, the old walls catch the last of the fading light and hold it for a moment, just a moment, before the dark comes in. The sentry has long since gone from the wall walk. The portcullis is frozen in its last position. Raised or lowered, it no longer matters which. The great hall is open to the sky, its roof gone, its hearth cold for centuries. And yet the castle is not empty, not entirely, because the stone is there and the stone remembers, in its own patient geological way, everything that was built into it, the intention, the ingenuity, the labour, the determination. The castle that was built to be nearly impossible to conquer has, in the end, conquered time itself, outlasting the armies that besieged it, the lords who held it, the social order that made it necessary, and the military technology that finally made it obsolete. It stands. It endures. That is perhaps the most appropriate end to a story about endurance. The night has grown very deep. The moonlight falls on the old stones in the way it has always fallen, finding the same surfaces, the same textures, the same angles that it has found for 8 centuries or 9. Somewhere an owl calls from the tower. Somewhere the wind finds a gap in the ruined battlements and makes a low, resonant note, almost musical, almost deliberate. The castle breathes. It has always breathed. It will breathe long after we have gone, long after we have told all our stories about it and gone to our rest, long after the last person who remembers what it was has been forgotten themselves. The stone is there. The walls stand. The long watch continues in the only form that is left to it, the patient, permanent presence of the thing that was built to last and has,